Hey guys, what's up? Today we're listening to Originals, the Chronicles of Vali Masters. So sit back, relax, and just enjoy the ride. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And if you're one of the OGs, welcome back. You already know, it's about to get real.
When I awoke, it didn't really feel like waking up. It felt as if one moment I was sleeping and the next my eyes were open and I was staring at a large white void all around me. For all intents and purposes, it should have registered as a dream to me, but something about it screamed reality into my mind. That would be my doing. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, and I had to admit, I immediately got a bit too excited. Are you a ROB? Is this actually happening to me? Yep. That was my first reaction. Too much time spent writing essays and reading fanfiction, it would seem. Instead of a million other terrible things that could be happening to me, I immediately jumped to the idea that a random omnipotent being had grabbed me for some grand adventure. Luckily for me, my stupid guess was actually right for once, yes, though not exactly random. To keep this short, I am you from an alternate universe where humanity ascended into omnipotence. Now we've spread ourselves across the entirety of reality to try to keep from stepping on each other's toes and have been left to our own devices. That was, actually, not that hard to wrap my head around. He was probably dumbing down a whole lot of everything for me. So what do you want with me? I eventually asked, more curious and less afraid than I probably should have been. His tone was amused when he responded, well, I think that'd be obvious. I'm here to give you a power-up and then drop you into a setting of our choosing. And given that I know exactly how your mind works, we both know what setting that will be. I can't help it, I grin and nod eagerly, about to open my mouth and begin babbling before he cut me off abruptly. That said, I will not be making you a 3,000-year-old hybrid in the Vampire Diaries verse so that you can lord it over all the other characters in the setting and be unkillable. Just no. I deflated immediately, letting out a rather morose, oh. And then I thought of something that made me begin to panic. You wouldn't drop me in that verse without some sort of power-up though, right? He snorted in response to that. Of course I wouldn't, you wouldn't last a day as an ordinary human in those circumstances. Besides, I already said I'm giving you something, didn't I? And it's a pretty good something. Here's the deal. I'm making you Esther's second bastard son by that werewolf she slept with. You'll be Klaus' younger brother. Older than Cole and Rebecca, a middle child so to speak. I wasn't about to mouth off to an omnipotent version of me, even if he probably did know I was thinking less than flattering things about him. Eventually I nodded slowly, having thought it over. I can work with that, yeah, I can make it work. Wonderful, because you're starting as an infant. My eyes widened at this parting sentence, my mouth opened to protest, and then all I had was darkness. Ch1, growing up again sucks. I wasn't really very aware in the first couple of years of my new life. My brain wasn't developed enough yet for me to truly understand or recognize that I was an adult trapped in a baby's body. Not that it mattered much, nothing special happened when you were a baby in the 11th century. Eventually, though, I was once more aware of my surroundings and more importantly who exactly I was and where I was. Unfortunately, my new family didn't speak English, they spoke Old Norse. So little me got to spend the first couple years of my life just figuring out what they were all saying. I did learn one important thing though. My new name was Vali, it seemed, which according to my mother's cooing was meant to mean powerful and strong. I had to wonder if she knew something that I didn't because frankly I wasn't exactly the most motivated guy in my previous life. Still, I had plenty of motivation now to become strong and powerful. After all, I didn't know how many years I had, but I would make sure to use every last one of them to prepare for immortality. I started as soon as I could. As soon as I was myself again, I began working on walking and talking. I would not slack off, not when I wanted to hone my mortal body as much as I could before it ended up essentially time-locked and immortal. I was speaking Old Norse relatively well by age 3, though not quite yet fluently to my frustration. Unfortunately, it seemed even Michael had lines he would not cross. Though I begged, he would not let me even touch a knife or bow while I was still 3. I stopped pressing the issue the first time he grew angry enough to backhand me to the ground. I did not wish to develop the same rapport with Michael as Klaus had, did not wish to be deemed weak or unworthy by the ancient Viking warrior. Biding my time, I waited until he decided I was a more appropriate age, and late in my 4th year he allowed me to begin learning how to hold a bow and how to skin an animal. I put all I had into this training, focusing all of my time and energy into learning what Mikael wanted of me. This served to alienate me from Klaus, my elder, by a year, as he was still a child in mind and saw more fun to be had in playing than learning. When I refused to indulge in more frivolous activities with him, it created a slight wedge between us that would only grow with time. On the other hand, I approached Finn and Elijah for extra practice with my newest tasks, and I felt as if I developed a decent enough relationship with the two of them. Elijah seemed a bit put off by my reserved attitude and the single-minded focus I put into the training given my supposed young age, but Finn seemed to enjoy the maturity I exhibited. Mikael approved in his own way as well. I did not receive much in the way of kind words, fatherly adoration, or even parental love from the man, but I got more approving nods and less beatings than I thought possible given the front row seat I had to the way he treated Niklaus over the years. Time went on and Cole was born, Rebecca was born, even Henrik was born. I took to sword training as soon as I could, as hard and fast as I did archery and skinning, only to find that this seemed to be something Klaus was a natural prodigy at, much to my chagrin. I put hundreds of hours into the art, and he put half the effort in to achieve the same level of skill as me. It was irritating to say the least, especially after he realized the advantage he had. In the end, I was forced to stop comparing my own swordplay to his after he beat me again and again. The lesson had been beaten into me well enough. My older brother was just better with a sword. He was even better than Elijah when given enough years to grow into his adult body. And that was as clear a sign as any, when I began to near my 20th birthday and noted how all of the Mikaelsons now looked much closer to how their immortal versions would look 1,000 years down the line. Things were finally coming to a head and I began to prepare for the events that would soon follow. The timeline was unchanged even with my presence. Because of my distance from my family, neither Klaus nor Henrik even considered letting me in on their plans to watch the werewolves change. I waited patiently with the rest of the family, and when morn came I watched dispassionately as Klaus came running up with Henrik's broken body. I watched as they grieved and quickly turned and walked away. Best not to stand there staring and come across as entirely cold-hearted. I had not allowed myself to grow attached to Henrik over the years, very aware that he was the sacrificial lamb to gaining immortality. Now it was only a matter of time. XXX. When Mikael came for me after our blood-laced dinner, his sword was already dripping red. I stood as he entered my room and focused my gaze on his. I overheard you and Mother planning. I apologize for eavesdropping, Father, but I understand what must be done. I am ready. Mikael looked surprised for a long moment, but then nodded, coming forward and clasping the back of my neck with his hand. It was probably the most affection he'd ever be capable of showing me, as he raised his blade and slid it into my unresisting heart. I had thought myself ready for death, but truly I really wasn't. The pain of being stabbed through the heart was greater than I expected, and though I'm sure my death could only have taken a few seconds, the agony stretched that out as I fell to the ground and breathed my last. Even still, my bloody lips slowly curled up into a wide grin as my eyes slowly closed for the not-so-final time. I came back to life suddenly, coming up off the ground with my eyes wide as I blinked rapidly to get things back into focus. Mikael was already there waiting with a mortal girl from the village. He held her bloody wrist out to me and spoke with a commanding tone, "Drink." I nodded and moved closer, feeling the itch in my gums that I was expecting as I leaned in and tasted the terrible copper of the blood coming from her wrist. A moment later the taste turned sweet and delicious and my fangs had popped in. I drank deeply before suddenly cutting myself off and coughing violently, tearing away from the appetizing food source in front of me. I wanted nothing more than to tear out her throat, drink every last bit of her blood out of her pretty little body until she had nothing left to give me. But I knew what that led to the curse being active, led to my turning at the next full moon and my hybrid body being placed under a curse that would probably last a millennium just like Klaus. All I had to do was wait, refrain from killing for just long enough to get past this first full moon. Esther would curse Klaus, Klaus would kill Esther, and everyone would flee our family home for the next 1,000 years. I had it all planned out, I just had to keep from killing anyone. That's why I was angry at myself more than anyone else when I regained control a few minutes later and let the body of the girl I just drained completely dry of her blood fall to the ground. I'd overestimated my self-control. I'd underestimated the powerful desire for blood that now coursed through my body, and I was now absolutely fucked when the next full moon came. Clenching my jaw, I did the one thing I could do. Strapping on my belt and grabbing my hunting knife, I moved to my sword and grabbed that as well before opening the door to look at the starry night sky, ready to vanish off into the wilderness, putting as much distance between me and my witch mother and her curses as I could, only to freeze up as I realized I was still bereft of a daylight ring. Fine, a couple more weeks and as soon as I had my ring I was gone. Gritting my teeth, I moved to our family's main gathering area to find my siblings and parents already there. All of us newly made immortals sported bloody faces, and Esther brought around a basin for us to clean ourselves with. I moved mechanically while doing so, knowing that I was now on a countdown. The moon would arrive in 3 short weeks, and by that time I had to be a ghost in the wind. As soon as morning came, the rest of my family found out they could not go outside. Things quickly became crowded in our home as the family was forced to all remain inside for the entirety of the day. I was never good with small spaces, so to distract myself I began testing and training my new reflexes. Pulling out a small knife and placed my hand palm down on the table, I slowly began weaving the knife through the gaps between my fingers. Back and forth I went before beginning to speed up over time. Each round through the gaps I went a little faster, until the knife was a blur and so was my arm. Faster and faster and fast. What are you doing? With a roar of pain I jumped as Rebecca's voice came right next to my ear and it startled me enough that my knife went straight through the back of my hand. Damn it, Rebecca! I shouted at her as her hands went to cover her mouth and I managed to pull the knife out of my hand and the table beneath that it had embedded into with some effort. Placing the knife down I brought my hand up and both Rebecca and I watched as the hole healed up. Nothing but a bit of blood left behind in less than a minute. I breathed in slowly and Rebecca slowly brought her hands down, leaving behind a gaping wide mouth as she stared at my hand in awe. After a moment her inherent curiosity got the better of her. Will you teach me that knife trick, brother? With a sigh I nodded and gestured for her to sit with me. As I showed Rebecca how to weave the blade in and out of her spread fingers, I couldn't help but think that this forced confinement would see me either reluctantly bonding with my family or wanting to kill the lot of them. Luckily I'd be leaving soon enough either way. Looking down at the ring set with enchanted lapis lazuli and then up into the unforgiving sun, I couldn't help but smile. The smile turned into a ferocious grin when I patted my vest and felt the folded piece of parchment upon which Esther had written down her new daylight ring spell. Given that the full moon was only 3 days away, I doubted Esther would survive long enough to miss it. To my left I found the beautiful form of my traveling companion beside me. Tadia, the Petrova doppelganger that had given her blood to turn myself and my family into immortal monsters. If I'd left her behind, she would have died at Elijah's hand and Esther would have covered it up to keep her son free of guilt. What I had planned for her, well, one could argue that she had a better chance with me than she did back in the village with Elijah. Tadia, I called to her after one more moment of silence. She turned to me almost mechanically and I smiled at the terror behind her eyes. She so very clearly wished nothing more than to run or scream or anything but stand there helpless. Unfortunately for her, compulsion had her body wrapped around my finger. Sighing, I reached up and brushed a hand through her dark hair, looking down into her equally dark eyes. Wrist, I ordered and her arm automatically came up. She was shaking rather badly as I leaned in and slowly slid my fangs into the offered wrist before beginning to drink. I closed my eyes and strived for that balance, for the control I sorely lacked at this point. Growling, I pulled myself away violently after a few moments, holding her up as she stumbled from dizziness. Biting into my own skin quickly, I grimaced as I brought the wound to her lips and she drank eagerly because of an earlier compulsion. She healed quickly, completely rejuvenated in just a few moments. I grinned and tilted her head up to look at me. You look like you want to say something, darling. Go ahead, but remember to keep your voice down. Her eyes searched mine for a long moment and she gulped convulsively before speaking with a rasp. Why are you doing this to me? Chuckling softly, I can't help but pet her hair again. She really is a beautiful creature, but even though I'd only been a vampire for a short time, it was all too easy to view humans as little more than animals. They were pets at best, a food source at worst. I pretended to consider her words while I stroked her dark hair for a moment longer. Before answering, I could say I was saving your life. My brother Elijah cares about you very much. However, like me, he is now a monster. His love and desire for you would have been subverted by the hunger he has lost control to. He would have killed you. I paused for a moment to let her assimilate that and then grinned, continuing, but honestly, I mostly just wanted you for myself. I needed a source of blood and I wanted beautiful company. You provide both, and I believe your beauty might even be helping me to slowly learn control. I have great incentive not to drain you dry. She grimaced at that. But you're killing me. I can feel the shadow of death every time you bite into my wrist. I smirk at that, bringing up the wrist I'd just bitten into and licking the remnants of blood off her healed skin. Not true, darling. My blood heals you, which is why I have compelled you to drink when I offer it. If I wished to, I could drink from you every few minutes so long as I made you drink from me. But I don't desire a feast, I desire to learn control. I have no desire to murder every human I run across after all, I explained patiently. I paused for a moment before continuing when it was clear she had no more questions for the moment. It also helps that if you do die while my blood is in your body, you will not truly die. You will be reborn into a vampire like myself and my family. Her eyes widen and I grin at the horror I see there. Now she has questions. This curse can be spread? You have infected me? Chuckling lightly, I nod. Do not fear, my dear. The chances of you surviving to become an actual vampire are slim. After returning from death, you will need to find human blood within a day, or you will die a true death. And even if you do manage that, the sun will become your mortal enemy. If you cannot acquire shelter during the day, it will burn you up until nothing but a charred corpse remains. She took this in and I could see how it affected her. She recognized that she was doomed. I was surprised when I saw that realization harden into resolve instead of causing her to break down. She turned her chin up at me, clenching her jaw. Dear worst demon, you will not succeed in tearing me down, and if I do become like you, I will end it myself. I couldn't help it. My grin stretched across my face until I probably looked terrifying with how hard I was smiling. She looked taken aback by my reaction as I cupped her face in my hands and leaned in until we were just shy of bumping noses. There it is, I murmured as she froze under my hands, the Petrova fire. I admit, for a long moment I was afraid you would not have it. I claimed her mouth then, kissing her roughly as I held her in place. She struggled as much as my compulsion allowed her to, yelping when one of my fangs broke the surface of her lip, and the kiss turned bloody. Unfortunately, this was not the right move on my part. A moment passed and my mouth slid down to her neck, and a moment after that the small bits of control I'd managed to obtain over the hunger were gone. With a groan, I released Tatia's lifeless body, letting it fall to the ground as I wiped my mouth. I looked down at her body for a long silent moment before flashing over to the nearest tree and slamming a fist into and through it. Damn it, damn it, damn it, damn it. I raged about the small clearing, tearing chunks out of trees and throwing a super-powered temper tantrum as I cursed my complete lack of control. Eventually, I plopped down on my ass, staring at Tatia for several long minutes. I certainly wasn't in love with this girl, but I also knew I felt a combination of lust and affection for the beautiful doppelganger. It seemed that lust combined with my hunger was more than enough to shred any control I could lay claim to. It seemed that learning not to kill my food was going to take longer than a few days of practice. With a growl, I rose to my feet and walked over to Tatia's body. Hefting it onto my shoulder easily, I blurred out of the destroyed clearing, heading towards the human settlement I'd been smelling and hearing for the last hour. When Tatia awoke again, she found herself sputtering as I forced human blood down her throat via the arm of a young man. What? She choked out, before her fangs were suddenly out, and a moment later she was latched onto the poor guy, draining him dry. Only once he was dead was she able to pull herself away, scrambling backwards with her eyes wide in horror. By the gods, no. She whispered before her gaze focused on me in all my bloody glory. I'd gone on a bit of a massacre since arriving in this small village, and my clothes hadn't really survived it unscathed. A moment later her expression twisted with ugly anger, and she was using her newfound speed to launch herself at me, tackling me to the ground and using her fingers like claws to scratch at my skin. With a snarl of my own, I captured her wrists in my hands and tumbled with her until I had her body trapped beneath mine. Pinning her there, I caught her gaze in my own and initiated the compulsion. Calm down. She almost instantly relaxed under me, her only movement the heaving of her chest as she gasped at the exertion she'd just put her new body through. Her eyes were wide though as she stared up at me. How? Even now you can still control me with your words? Am I not a monster as well? She actually sounded angry about it, as if the one thing good about becoming a vampire had been snatched from her almost instantly. Which, to be fair, that was exactly what happened, wasn't it? Grinning down at her, I can't help but brush the errant hair from her face. She'd grown quite disheveled in our fighting. I had to restrain myself from tearing her clothes off then and there and taking her against the hard floor of the hut, but I rejected that out of hand. I was now immortal and I had 1,000 years to learn how to seduce women without use of force. I disliked the idea of beginning that eternity by raping my first creation. I sighed before finally speaking. I understand your confusion, love. Yes, you are like me now. But unlike you, I am one of the originals. We have a bit more power than those who will come after us. Of which you are the first, I believe. She clenches her jaw at that. Not for long, she bites out. I will end this horrid existence myself as soon as possible. I couldn't help but frown at that. The idea of my first creation killing itself just didn't sit well with me. At the same time, forcing her to live forever because of my lack of control did feel wrong in a way. Gritting my teeth, I settled on a course of action after several minutes of contemplation. No, you will not. Leaning in and initiating compulsion once more, I spoke carefully. You will do your absolute best to survive for the next 100 winters. At the end of that time you may choose to end your life if you still wish to. You will not plot against my family or myself, and you will present yourself to me for orders if ever you run across me. Do you understand? Nodding jerkily, Tadia succumbs to the mind control once more. I smile pleasantly in response, taking one last moment to explore her beautiful features before finally releasing her and moving away. Unfortunately, it's time for us to part ways, love. In 2 days I will become a wolf for the first time, and if you are near me I might feel tempted to tear you apart. There are several humans left alive in this village, so I am not leaving you without food. Take care of yourself, Tadia. I can no longer watch over you. I made myself out as some sort of guardian, and I could see from the incredulous look on her face that she thought I was full of shit. I grinned down at her and then I left.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Hold up. Stop for a sec. Look, if you've already made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on, subscribe, bro. Help a brother out, man. It's one tiny click for you, but it's a massive, and I mean massive, heck yeah, for me. Plus, it keeps the algorithm from thinking I'm boring, and we both know that's a total lie. All right. I'm done. I'll get out of the way now so you can get back to the good stuff. Stick around and finish listening. It's worth it. Peace.
Left in a blur of vampire speed. XXX. The transformation I went through on that first full moon was simultaneously horrifically painful and immensely liberating. It turns out that breaking every bone in one's body does in fact hurt quite a lot. Vampire healing doesn't do much to dull the pain of werewolf transformation. But once I was the wolf, I felt so incredibly free. The power at my disposal, the strength in my animal body, both managed to leave me in awe. I didn't find any humans during that full moon, but the animals of the forest I'd been wandering through suffered greatly for my existence that night. By the morning I'd bagged enough kills to feed any of the human settlements one would find in this time for a good 6 months. Not that any humans would have been able to make use of my kills considering the pieces I felt obligated to tear them all into. At the same time, there were some definite downsides to the transformation. I could not do much besides kill and slaughter as a wolf. After I transformed back, it took me an hour to find the spot I left my clothes in, given how much I'd roamed and hunted in the night. At the end of the day, being able to become a wolf at will would be useful if and when I encountered wolves, witches, and vampires, but I'd happily remain in humanoid form the majority of the time. Such thoughts turned out to be pointless, however, when a week later I felt a sudden pain in my chest, and a strange weakness overtook me. I had been wrong, it seemed, when I thought I could flee the curse. I could feel the magic as it bound my wolf side, could feel as the option to transform was locked away from my reach. Esther hadn't bound Klaus personally, she'd bound the bloodline created from her coupling with the werewolf. I raged over it for months, considering the fact that Tadia's doppelganger blood could have in fact ended the curse, if I hadn't killed and turned her in my lack of control. In the end, I came down from my rage after massacring more than one human settlement. It seemed I would share my brother's fate, 1,000 years of being cursed. To be fair, I had no desire to actually sire more hybrids. I liked being one of 2 immortal all-powerful hybrids. Now I was just an immortal powerful vampire. It seemed that when it came time to, I would help Klaus in completing the ritual, help him sacrifice the doppelganger and unlock our true power. Until then though, I'd be enjoying my eternal life. 1062 AD. I smiled at the young Native American woman as she sat in my lap and slowly slid herself up and down my hard length, her fingers working at her clit as I'd shown her, her eyes heavily lidded as she let out a continuous moan. Leaning in, I captured one of her nipples in my mouth, nibbling and suckling at the nub as my hands ran over her silky smooth skin. She groaned as I tugged her nipple a bit with my teeth, and I grinned before pulling her closer, hands falling to grasp her tight ass as I began to thrust up into her at a much harder and faster pace, causing her to gasp and throw her head back, exposing her throat to my gaze. Burying my nose in the crook of her neck, I smiled as I breathed in her scent. It had taken quite some time, but I was no longer a slave to my hunger. I had control now. With a sudden growl and speed that only a vampire could claim, I spun her around and pushed her onto her hands and knees, before thrusting into her from behind with increased vigor. Her heart rate sped up from arousal, not fear, because of course she and her tribe knew exactly what I was capable of by this point. Securing my place with these folk had required far less compulsion than you'd have thought, though I had murdered their former shaman before revealing myself, as I feared he would be more magical and more aware of what I was than I was prepared to deal with. Now that same shaman's apprentice and the eldest daughter of the tribe's chief was taking my thick hard cock at faster and faster speeds, because she saw my power and sought to attach herself to me. I could appreciate her attempts at manipulation, even if they were more than obvious to me. I could hear her heartbeat getting faster and faster, could hear her panting and how she had to constantly bite her lower lip to hold her screams in. Grinning, I leaned over her, a hand finding its way to her clit, taking over where her own work had left off when I'd forced her to plant her hands firmly on the ground just to keep me from driving her into the ground. Thrusting deeply into her and pinching her clit at the exact same moment, I was rewarded with a high-pitched scream as she hit the edge and went right over it, her body convulsing with her rather violent climax. She collapsed beneath me, but I wasn't done yet, not by far. Curling a hand around her front to grasp her by the throat, I pulled her exhausted body up against my chest and began to thrust up into her from below, causing her to grunt with each sheathing of my cock inside her nubile young body. Finally, I lowered my head to her neck, fangs coming out and sliding into her skin as I bit deep and drank from her. This right here, this feeling of power and this delicious taste, it was euphoric. I reached my own climax like that, drinking slowly from her as I filled her with my seed. I pulled free of her neck and pushed her forward off of my length, causing her to gasp as she fell to the furs below us. Wiping my mouth, I looked down at my handiwork with a slight grin before biting the tip of my thumb and holding it close to her lips. Ever so slowly, she reached up and brought the bleeding tip to her lips, licking perversely, before swallowing the entire finger in her mouth with a low moan, her tongue swirling around it erotically as she drank the healing liquid. Eventually, I pulled the finger away, but it was long after the bite on her neck had healed. Slowly, she rose off the ground to kneel before me, eyes kept down as she looked to the ground. I couldn't help but smirk at the deference. When I'd first shown myself to the tribe, they'd be understandably hostile and wary of me. When I defeated all of their warriors without taking a single wound, it turned to fear of what I was capable of. After I showed that my blood could heal the wounds I'd inflicted on those same warriors, it became respect. I'd spent the last 5 years with this tribe, and they still thought I couldn't speak or understand their language. At first I actually couldn't, of course, but I was not stupid. I'd taken the time and listened to every word they said to each other. By now I had a good idea of what they were saying, but I had no desire to let them know that, so we communicated mostly through gestures. Waving a hand dismissively at her, I saw the young woman's eyes flick up to note the gesture, and then watched her stand and turn, wobbling a bit on unsteady legs with a bit of my seed dripping down her thighs. This was how she left the spacious tent the humans had provided me with, completely naked, in all her fresh-fucked glory. I hadn't ordered it that way, but she seemed to think debasing herself would please me for some reason. The fact that she was right didn't truly factor in now, did it? My contemplation of this was cut off suddenly, however, when I heard the distant sound of battle cries. It would seem the tribe I'd taken refuge with was under attack. Sighing, I stood slowly and rolled my shoulders. I should really deal with that. I wouldn't tolerate threats to my semi-peaceful hedonistic existence. I snarled as I exited my tent, prepared to do battle only to be brought up short by who I found in the center of the camp. My eyes widened as I took in Mikael in all his Viking warrior glory. He held a bloodied sword, and given that there was 3 warriors at his feet all missing limbs, figuring out where that blood came from wasn't too hard. He froze up upon seeing me as well, eyes widening before narrowing, Vali? Of course the shock didn't last long before being replaced by anger, and a moment later he'd planted his sword firmly in my stomach, causing me to choke in pain. But neither of us were the mortal men we once were, and I was not the whelp he'd once known. One hand came down on where his two-handed grip held his sword to keep his hands there, and the other curled into a fist, which I slammed into his throat with as much force as I could. The dirty move did what I hoped and sent him reeling, gurgling from the crushed trachea. Fortunately, my hand and body wouldn't let his sword come with him, forcing him to let go as he stumbled back several steps. I pulled his sword out of my gut swiftly with only a slight grimace and held it loosely at my side even as I finally responded to his earlier question. Father? I saw his fingers flex as he slowly straightened, his throat already healed, and I knew in that moment he already had that white oak stake that could kill us. And he was considering pulling it out to use on me. I smiled to hide the fear I felt as I spoke. Now that we've greeted one another, I hope things can be a bit more cordial between us. His hands continued to flex as he narrowed his eyes and spoke through grit teeth. You fled, you abandoned your family. He was still angry, but it seemed he was either unwilling to use the stake on me, or simply wary now of exposing its existence to me. I smiled pleasantly. Well, I saw the way things were going. Let me guess, Klaus is a bastard? Mother is dead? The rest of my brothers and sisters have split off and fled in the face of your cruelty. Michael was slowly turning a strange mixture of angry and confused. How could you possibly know that? You ran off a full week before all of that happened. I laughed and pointed his sword at him accusingly. Come, father, was I not always the most inquisitive? Was I not always the one who knew more than he should? When you came to slide this blade through my heart, I knew exactly why. Just as I knew Mother was not faithful to you. There is a reason I never got along with Klaus, that filthy mutt. I sigh and lower the blade towards the ground again before shaking my head and speaking in my best heartfelt voice, but I could not stand to betray any of you. I could not stand being there and keeping secrets from you. I could not even consider betraying Mother's secrets either. Father, I left because I love you all too much to choose between you. And now my worst fears have come true. Mother is dead, and by whose hand? Yours? I watched as Michael physically flinched at that accusation before snarling back a response. No. Niklaus would have you think that has convinced your brothers and sister of it, but it was him. He tore her heart out of her chest. And I assure you he will pay for that. By the end of his little rant he was pointing his finger at me as he promised my elder brother retribution, and I smiled confidently. I'm sure he will, father. Do you know where my siblings have fled to? I do. His eyes widen and narrow once more, this time in suspicion. Of course I don't know where they've gone. If I did, I wouldn't be here amongst this filth. How can you possibly know where they've gone? My smile turns to a smirk as I rest the tip of the sword on the ground and treat it somewhat like a cane. I'd think it'd be obvious, father. Klaus is afraid of you, and if he's convinced the others of his lies, so are they. Where else would they go but back to the old world? They have put a sea between themselves and you. Michael seemed to consider this for several long moments before nodding. There is truth in your words. They have most likely fled across the sea. He paused to think for another moment before continuing. I will follow and you will come with me. I raised an eyebrow inquisitively, even though I'd been expecting such a demand. I will not, father. I told you I have no desire to stand with any of our family against each other. Until either you or Niklaus is dead, I will not seek out any of the others. Michael clenched his jaw in clear anger, before his eyes seemed to flick around to the tribe who'd been watching us warily. More warriors had shown up, even the chieftain himself, but they knew that they couldn't handle Michael and were forced to just stand by while we talked. In an instant Michael flashed away before appearing back where he'd been with the chieftain's daughter in his arms. She'd found clothes at some point in the current madness, but I saw the fear in her eyes as he held her back against his chest, his hand caressing her throat, clearly ready to tear it out. He sneered, I can smell you all over this one, my son. You clearly care for her. Come with me and leave this filth behind, or I'll slaughter her and everyone here. I stood stony for a long moment, my eyes locked with Michael's, before I let a slow smile grow across my face. Come now, father. You should know me better than that. Caring? Caring only gets you dead. Michael pursed his lips together as he studied me for a long moment. Finally he spoke. No, I don't believe that, son. I will give you one more chance to concede and come with me. I will not ask so nicely again. My eyes narrowed at that and silence filled the clearing before my smile turned predatory. Then believe this, father. Learn this lesson now, lest my bastard brother end up managing to kill you. Never back a monster into a corner. With that said, I moved forward with the blinding speed of our race, sword held poised as I slammed it straight through the girl Michael held prisoner, and into Michael himself. Michael's face was one of shock, while the girl's was one of poignant betrayal. Behind me, I heard the roar of anger and heartbreak from the chieftain whose daughter I'd just murdered. I left the blade inside the girl and Michael, leaving him free to force it out of the two of them as I turned to the tribe and bared my vamp face, fangs out, eyes blood red. Only now did the chieftain realize what he was truly dealing with. The look on his face when he figured out that I was not a gift sent by the gods but a demon who'd brought ruin to them all was more than a little enjoyable. After that, things moved fast. Michael managed to get free of his own blade and the chieftain and every able-bodied man in the tribe attacked. Of course, we killed them all in rather short order. At the end of it, Michael turned to me, now holding his sword once more, and frowned. "You have become cold, Vali. You still will not come with me?" I smirked and stepped closer to him, before holding out the white oak stake that had fallen free of his vest in the fighting. "Plant this in my bastard brother's heart and avenge my mother, then come find my father. Until then, I have no family." Michael's eyes widened dramatically as he slowly takes the stake from me, placing it back in his vest and nodding slowly. "Very well, son. I will put down the abomination and cleanse this taint. Then I will find you." My smile turns more pleasant this time. "Wonderful. Well, father, I think it's time you were on your way. I have a bit of cleanup to take care of after all." We both can hear the frantic heartbeats of the women and children in the tents, and Michael's face twists into a disgusted grimace for half a moment, before he's gone in a burst of speed. I let out a low sigh of relief once I was sure he was gone. God damn, but that was some serious acting. I was rather proud of how I managed to trick Michael. Luckily for me, it seemed Esther had taken the secret of her second infidelity to her grave. And now I believe I had managed to secure a place as Michael's current favorite child. With a snort, I walked over to where the chieftain's daughter lay dead, and sat on the ground beside her body. I felt a bit bad about what I'd had to do to her. She'd been a decent lay, eager to learn and eager to please. Still, she'd wanted a taste of my power, and now she'd have it. As if she could hear my thoughts, she suddenly woke, gasping in air with eyes wide as she propped herself up on her hands and knees and looked around. When she saw me, she immediately scrambled backwards in fear, only to bump into the groaning body of one of her people. I didn't remember who, but Michael or I had torn the arm carrying his bow clean off and left him to fall where he lay. He'd probably be dead quite soon as it was, but when the girl turned and saw him, her horror only lasted a moment, before her eyes locked on the blood seeping from his wounds. I watched with interest as she leaned in like she was under a trance and slowly licked up the blood. A moment later her fangs were out and she was feasting on the poor boy, draining him dry. And then she was on the rest of the injured who still lived, even her own father. I watched for several long moments, but it was clear she wasn't regaining control anytime soon. It was time to move on, but first I wanted to cover my bases. Flashing over to the new vampire, I grabbed her by the throat and forced her to look me in the eye even as she fought against my grip almost instinctively. Then I initiated compulsion, hoping that this would transcend language barriers. "Hello, darling, I really am sorry for all this. Here's what I need from you. You will never seek to harm me or my family. If you ever see me again, you will present yourself for orders. You will do your best to keep the truth of vampires hidden from humans. Do you understand?" She nodded slowly, pupils dilated, and I was forced to believe that the mind control did in fact go beyond language barriers. With a grim smile I released her, letting her go back to her feast and abandoning the slaughtered camp for greener pastures. Once again it was time to move on. 1145 AD. One truth of the world is that no matter where you go or what time period you are in, there would always be those who sought more power. Even the guardians of nature themselves had to have those amongst them who were susceptible to corruption. Still, it took me over a century to finally find rumor of a possible witch who would be willing to work with an abomination. The last one I'd approached had mentioned a name while ranting about how she'd never help a monster like me. Charlotte was the name I carefully filed away, and Charlotte was who I sought out, and who it seemed I'd finally found now. Smiling, I knocked politely on the door frame of the hut. There was no door, but it still registered as a threshold and would not let me enter without an invitation. Within the hut I could see the witch leaned over some sort of table, reading carefully. She jumped at my knocking and turned to eye me up and down. I gave her my best disarming smile, even as I took her in as well. She was not unappealing to look at, even with her body mostly covered by stained dark robes. Her hair was rather unkempt, but her face was clear of blemish and she had a look of strength to her that appealed to me. Slowly she made her way to me, stopping just inside the hut and staring at me with suspicion before finally asking, "Who are you? What do you want?" I just grinned in response. "Charlotte, I presume? I am in need of your assistance. I've been told you are a witch of some skill and power, yes?" My charisma wasn't enough to keep the woman from being suspicious of me, as she scowled but replied grudgingly, "I am. I don't work for free though. What do you need and what are you willing to offer?" "Straight to business then." Nodding, I pulled a small sheaf of parchment from the inside of my vest. It was a copy of my mother's daylight spell, meticulously transferred from the original parchment to this new one. I'd made several copies at this point that I intended to dole out to various witches over the centuries. It would be a bargaining chip to any witch who practiced dark magic or was open-minded enough to want power over vampires. Smiling, I held out the parchment. "I require you to do this spell on 50 pieces of jewelry that I will provide. As for what I have to offer, well, that depends entirely upon what you need, doesn't it?" She takes the spell from me and looks it over for several long moments. I can see the flash of recognition on her face when she realizes what it will do. She looks at me with a frown and says, "Abomination." Only it is not a tone of disgust, distaste, or outright hatred that I've come to expect from witches, more of a neutral statement describing my condition. I smirk and bow at the waist. "Guilty as charged, my dear." As I straighten, I notice how her eyes move to my neck and my hands, and I watch as her frown deepens. With a curious tone, she asks me a question I enjoy answering immensely, "And where is your jewelry?" I grin and pull the ring my mother made for me from my pocket, holding it up to let the sun behind me glance off the enchanted lapis lazuli that was socketed in the metal. With a shrug, I hold it out for her to inspect even as I reply, "I find myself not requiring it. Perhaps I am special in some way." Discovering that I'd waited for a daylight ring for 2 weeks, cooped up with my so-called family the entire time when I had not needed it at all to go out into the sun. Well, I was a mixture of frustrated and amused with myself over the entire thing. I had been so afraid of a silly sunburn that I hadn't even bothered testing if the sun would hurt me or not before I received the ring. It was ridiculous. Turning my attention back to Charlotte, I saw she'd gotten over the disquieting idea that I was something stronger than a normal vampire and was now studying the daylight ring I was holding out with a ferocious curiosity. "Well, can you do it?" I eventually asked, pulling the ring back and drawing a displeased squawk from her. Still, she considers the question for a long moment as well as the spell in her hands before nodding slowly. "I can do it, yes. It will take time to make 50 though, and you will have to compensate me in return." I was quite pleased to hear that. Finally a witch I could work with, one who was reasonable. I smile and nod, "Of course, darling. What can I do for you?" Finally she allows a grin to creep onto her face as she outlines what she requires of me. "I have a sister. She's not like me, her mind isn't open to the true possibilities of magic. She'd probably turn you away if you approached her. She prefers healing and balance and all that rot, and she's a complete self-righteous bitch." Charlotte growls and spits to the side before continuing, "I wouldn't even care about all of that, but she has our mother's grimoire and I'm the elder sister. That grimoire should have gone to me. Retrieve it for me and then make sure that my sister never practices magic again." I raise an eyebrow at that. "Please, my dear, speak clearly. Do you wish me to turn her or kill her?" Charlotte smiles grimly in response. "I don't care which, so long as you can control her. If she kills me after becoming a vampire, there will be no daylight rings for you. Do we have a deal?" I grin and nod before pulling out a bag that clinks as I hold it out to my new witch. "We have a deal, dear Charlotte. I look forward to a productive relationship." A week later I returned to Charlotte's hut with the grimoire in hand. I'd toyed with the idea of turning her sister and using her as the start of my new plan, but Charlotte had been right. The woman had been unbearable to be around. Draining her of her blood after spending an hour tricking her into a false sense of security had been incredibly fulfilling. I'd probably cherish the memory for years to come. Charlotte smiled when she saw the tome in my hands and brought forth my bag of freshly made daylight rings. I smiled in return before flashing away and returning with a cloaked docile figure and without the grimoire. This caused the witch to frown in agitation and confusion as I beckoned for the bag, but she eventually acquiesced, handing it over. Opening it up, I looked in and saw the way the enchanted lapis lazuli set in each small ring glowed in the sun. Still, I was not the type to trust easily, especially not witches. Taking one of the rings, I forced my hooded companion to remove a boot, their skin instantly blistering under the sun until I placed the toe ring on their smallest toe. With that done, I pulled the hood off of my mind-controlled baby vamp and watched as he stood there completely unaffected by the sun. Smiling and nodding, I proceeded to change out the toe ring for another, his skin blistering and healing between each one. I tried 15 random rings this way and found that they all worked. Nodding to myself, I put all the rings back in the bag and turned my attention back to Charlotte as the baby vamp burst into flames and died behind me. Her gaze was fixed on him as I flashed away and then flashed back with the grimoire, holding it out to her after securing my new bag of daylight rings. "A pleasure working with you, Charlotte. When you have children, tell them that if they ever need help, they may seek out Vali. I will do my best to repay your line for however many centuries it lasts." Charlotte blinks at that promise even as she takes the grimoire, nodding jerkily in response to my words. I gave a lazy salute that probably just confused her, and then I left the witch behind to enjoy her new grimoire. If I could have, I would have used compulsion on her, but unfortunately it didn't work on witches. I really didn't want to get into the habit of killing off witches who'd helped me either, so Charlotte got to live and had my given name so her descendants could find me once again. If her family ever approached me in the future, well, I'd make sure to use them as much as they used me. 1220 AD. I wasn't entirely sure where I'd ended up, but I thought I was somewhere on the east coast of South America. I'd spent the last several decades building what basically amounted to a cult. It was rather easy to convince humans to follow me when my blood was actually a healing agent and I offered eternal life. We traveled as nomads for 7 decades, moving along and gathering up newcomers as we went. It turned out to be incredibly easy to run a cult when one was immortal and could back up one's claims with true power. Now, my first followers' children had had children, and those children were now in their 20s and absolutely loyal to me. They'd never known anything but me, their leader and savior, the reason they were never injured or sick for longer than a day. I didn't just have their loyalty, I had their adoration, their devotion. And soon that devotion would be eternal. Smiling at the thought, I looked over my community as they all gathered in the large cavern we'd hollowed out over the last month for this purpose. No sunlight here, torches were the only light in the dark chamber. Looking down from the throne of rock they'd carved out for me, I gazed upon my kneeling followers in silence. I'd had them fasting for the last week to show their devotion, and it meant they were also all completely free of my blood as well. With a gesture, 50 of my people moved forward, all young and relatively attractive. They wore robes of red where everyone else wore robes of white. These were my best, my chosen, and they knew it too. They stepped up to the table beneath my throne and one at a time, drank from the goblets of blood found there. I watched on with approval as they all stepped back and knelt before me, simultaneously pulling out knives and very slowly cut their own throats. Soon enough I had 50 corpses knelt before me, mostly only kept upright by their proximity to one another, the bodies having ended up leaning on each other for support. There was silence for several long moments, before I began hearing murmurs from those still alive. My eyes flashed red in the torchlight and silenced them, the entire community catching sight of my eyes and staring in silent awe. I had planned this out meticulously and the next phase would be starting quiet soon. A few minutes later, my children woke to a new world, the entire line of red-robed bodies coming back to life at the same time. They looked at each other with wide eyes, most glancing down at the bloodied hole in their robes where they'd stabbed themselves in the heart, touching it with their hands before looking at me with entirely new reverence. It was at this time that those who still wore white took their own knives from their robes and slowly drew the blades across their hands. The newly made vampires before me immediately found their attention diverted, turning as one to the smell of human blood now exposed to the air. My smile slowly grew as they moved towards the human fodder I'd provided. Everyone knew their part in the plan, everyone knew their place in the new order I'd promised. It was time for those in white robes to ascend as a reward for their sacrifice. I sat calmly and watched as my new vampires tore apart those who used to be their friends and family for the precious blood in their veins. The feast went on for an hour before all of my new children had regained control of themselves. More than a few were understandably in hysterics, but while most looked to me for guidance, a few fled for the entrance of the cave. I let them go, watching as they returned within moments with burnt flesh, screaming of how the sun caused such great pain now. This caused more of the new vampires to begin to go into hysterics as well, until I finally took control of the situation. "Silence," I hissed out, immediately attracting the attention of every single immortal in the cave. They had after all been taught to defer to me all their lives. Slowly I stood from the throne and looked down upon them all. They immediately calmed and moved back into a line, kneeling before me and waiting for further word from me. I was more than a little pleased at seeing that their conditioning remained intact through the transition. As I looked over them, I saw a lot of emotions, but in the majority of them I still saw trust in me, their savior. With a smile, I pulled free a very special bag I'd been keeping safe for 75 years for this very purpose. I opened it and pulled free one of the small enchanted rings, beckoning a young girl with bright red hair forward with the hand holding the ring. She moved forward carefully but with purpose, no hesitation in her at all as she approached, and I handed her the ring. She frowned as she found that it did not fit any of her fingers, causing me to laugh before telling her gently, "It is meant to go on your toe, my dear." She blinked at that before removing the slippers they were all wearing and placing the small unobtrusive piece of jewelry on one of her toes. After she'd put her slippers back on, I smiled and clasped my hand on the side of her neck, locking gazes with her. "Now be a dear and go outside, have a little fun and luxuriate in the sun, but then come back, all right?" I reinforced my statement with compulsion to make sure she returned and then released her so she could rush off to go outside. I beckoned the next of my children forward and continued the process with each of them. The first returned soon enough and spoke to those still in line of how the sun did not harm her and how she'd never felt more free or powerful. Eventually all 50 of my new daywalkers got a taste of the sun on their skin without burning, and all 50 of them were back inside kneeling before me. I smiled benevolently as I looked them over before asking a question. "Who am I to you, my children?" The reply came from every mouth at the same time, drilled into them from the time they could speak. "The Master." I look at them all with affection, "And now that you've all ascended to immortality, you are my disciples. It is time to reaffirm the oath you took when you became adults, as you are now reborn." Gesturing once more to the young woman who'd received the first daylight ring, I waited patiently as she approached and knelt before me. Smiling, I stepped up to stand before her, placing my hands on her cheeks and turning her face up towards mine. Gazing into her eyes, I said, "Repeat after me," and then initiated the compulsion and began to speak. I'd been refining this so-called oath for decades now through the use of my human cult. "You will obey the Master. The Master's work comes above all else, and his goals and plans are your goals and your plans. You will not kill mortals unless they threaten your life or your freedom. You will not reveal your true nature unless it is unavoidable. You will not seek public leadership. Ours is to guide from the shadows." I smiled as she repeated the oath word for word back to me, replacing the yous and yours with I's and my's. When she was done, I released her and let her step back, letting the next step forward and once more compelling them as they spoke the oath. Eventually I was through all 50 of my new disciples and I smiled, looking them over for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Wonderful. You have all taken the first step on the path towards perfection. With me as your guide, you will be able to achieve true enlightenment." I was channeling insane cult leader pretty hard by this point, but my loyal disciples ate it up, adoration across their faces as they stared up at me. I figured given time that adoration might fade, but if I had to I could always slaughter the lot and start over fresh. Grinning at that particularly heartless thought, I gestured for them to all rise. As they stood, I stepped amongst them before moving past them and towards the entrance to the cave. The years that follow, 1220 AD and on. Starting from that day on, I began to teach and train my new disciples. They learned to fight using their fast reflexes in every fighting style I'd managed to pick up so far. They learned to read and write in the languages that I knew, and they learned my plans for the world and how they would fit into them. Most importantly, I taught my new children how to be vampires. I taught them how to hunt first, and showed them the difference in strength between feeding off of human blood and feeding off of animal blood. It was interesting to learn that the compulsion I'd put on them forced them to stop feeding and mechanically force their blood on the humans they managed to catch. If they got their prey close to death, they immediately went out of their way to stop the death from being their fault. I taught them compulsion and knew that more than a few of them began to realize what I'd done, figuring out that their actions were not always their own. Yet they did nothing because the majority was far too indoctrinated to even care that they weren't in control. Having been raised to view me as their god and master, to most it seemed inherently right that I have control of them. I taught them their weaknesses, showed them what vervain would do to them and how they had to achieve permission to enter someone's home. They knew the danger of the sun, but thanks to the rings on their feet they had nothing to worry about on that front. I told them that sharpened wood of any sort piercing their heart would rob them of their immortality and kill them permanently. And thus did I sow the first seeds of rebellion, giving the 2 disciples most discontent with being under my thumb a supposed way to kill me. XX scene breaks X. I thought nothing of it when the girl came to me in the evening and removed her robes to expose her eternally beautiful body. My male disciples knew that I wasn't interested, but my female disciples had learned early that I appreciated intimacy and was more than willing to satisfy their desires. I wasn't one to approach though, content to observe from afar. But my children were now vampires and that made one far less oblivious to one's surroundings, so they eventually saw me looking. When the most ambitious had first presented herself to me, baring her body and sauntering over to me as seductively as she possibly could, I'd welcomed her with open arms. I'd then proceeded to fuck her through 12 screaming orgasms and left her spent face down on my bed. After that word had spread and I usually had a partner every night. The position was won by some sort of game of chance from what I understood. So of course I took this one into my bed like the others and enjoyed her supple body with great passion. The attack came while I was plunging into her from behind, gripping her ass hard enough to leave bright red marks, when someone ironically plunged a stake straight through my back and into my heart. I roared in pain even as I fell to the side of the girl, who immediately moved off the bed. I stared with angry eyes as my attacker wrapped my bed partner in a hug and they both looked down at me, clearly intending to watch me die. Unfortunately for my wayward children, they were going to end up incredibly disappointed. In an instant I was on my feet with one hand curled around my attacker's throat and the other around the neck of the girl who'd clearly be used as a distraction. The fear in their eyes was delicious and I took a moment to drink it in, but in the end it did little to settle the intense anger I felt over their actions. Dragging them by their half-crushed throats, I moved out of my tent and into the center of the camp. A few disciples were still loitering about, and I heard shocked cries upon the view I presented them with, of me with a stake through my heart and a bloodied front, along with the 2 in my grasp. Raising my voice I roared out, "Disciples! Come!" It took less than 10 seconds for all of the remaining disciples not already around me to arrive. As they gazed upon me, I saw shock and fear slowly turn to awe as they realized I was not dead from what I'd told them was a fatal wound. Then I watched as that awe slowly turned to doubt, as they wondered if I had lied to them. With a snarl I dropped the girl at my feet, her neck snapped cleanly to keep her from running off any time soon. Then I slowly pulled the stake free of my chest by its tip, before spinning it around and driving it into the heart of the boy who dared attack me. He choked out once before beginning to gray, and I let him fall as well before gesturing around. "Come and see what happens to those who plot behind my back," I say a bit more calmly, watching as they creep forward and stare at the very dead body of their former comrade. I give them time to fully comprehend the truth of things. I was the one who was immune to the stake I'd warned them all against. They, on the other hand, were decidedly not. A few moments later, as I let them study the corpse, the girl who'd played the role of distraction came back to life with a gasp. My disciples immediately backed away as I reached down and grabbed her by the throat once more, pulling her to her feet. She immediately began begging for forgiveness, apologizing profusely for her actions and condemning her dead partner in crime as having forced her into it. I ignored her, instead looking around the camp center to make sure all of my disciples were paying attention. If someone is stronger than you, the stake is entirely unnecessary. For example, pausing in my speech, I plunged my hand into her naked chest, my fingers curling around her heart as she's screaming in pain. I held it there for a moment before continuing to lecture. "If you lose your heart, you will die just as permanently. Shall I show you all?" I found reverent expressions on the faces of my children. They seemed to have decided that the girl deserved her fate, whatever I chose it to be, even as she sobbed in pain. I was almost ready to pull her heart free from her chest and end her miserable existence when a cry of "Please no" rent through the air. In a moment one of my other female disciples was before me. Given the resemblance between the two of them, I assumed a familial bond. She seemed to be waiting for permission to speak, but when I just stared at her, she spoke anyways, her tone one of pleading. "I beg of you, master, spare her." If anyone need be punished, let it be me for allowing that filth at your feet to spend so much time with her, letting him fill her head with lies about you." I stared at her for one more long moment before letting my expression soften, and slowly pulling my bloodied hand free of her sister's chest, leaving the heart behind and letting the gaping wound begin to heal. "I am a forgiving master, am I not?" Holding the naked sobbing girl a bit more gently, I handed her off to her sister and smiled graciously. "I give you her life, my dear." Thanking me profusely, she took her younger sister from me and held her close, brushing her hair softly and rocking her to calm her down. As she did so, I looked around at my disciples and watched as they shifted about, staring at the awkward scene. Making a decision, I hissed out the words, "All of you will be still." Just loud enough for all 49 of my remaining children to hear. Frozen in place by the compulsion I'd already layered on them when I'd told them to always obey me, they stood there as I sped about the camp and grabbed each of them, locking gazes to initiate compulsion and murmuring the words, "You will never attack me." Eventually I was done and I came back to where I'd stood before them all. "Relax, you may move." The shifting began again, filled with much more anxiety this time at my blatant use of the power most of them had suspected me to have over them. Nobody tried to flee though, causing me to smile. That was more for your safety than my children. If any of you ever tries to attack me again, I will know something stronger than you is controlling your mind. This means I can do my best to ensure I do not kill you while defending myself. I explained this easily, and saw faith and trust in the eyes of my followers. Looking down at the body of the one I'd killed, I sighed. He will be given a burial but no tombstone. The first of my children to die, let him also be the last and let him be erased. With those dismissive words, I turned and moved back inside my tent, leaving my followers to deal with the body. Over the next dozen decades, I would work my disciples to the bone, training them in the use of every single one of their powers. We explored South America in its entirety, starting the early stages of my plan. The number of vampires sired to me grew as I allowed some of my disciples to turn human lovers and friends that they'd made along the way. These new vampires took the same oath and were put under the same compulsions as my disciples, but they were not my original children, and this was made quite clear by adding another compulsion to the oath to always obey the orders of my disciples. Until all 50 of the originals died, I would not even consider making another vampire myself. Still, to take control of an area as large as South America would take a great number of vampires and mind-controlled humans. It was best to start now. 1340 AD. I told my disciples of werewolves as well. How they were to avoid all wolf packs on the night of the full moon, lest they receive a fatal werewolf bite. In one of the villages we visited, I was able to acquire dozens of small containers. I filled each with my blood and passed them out to my children, explaining that even a drop could cure them of a werewolf bite if they had need of it. Of course, I had no intentions of perpetuating the feud my father had begun with the werewolves. I taught my disciples to always show respect to the wolf packs, even when it was not a full moon. I advocated making friends with the wolves and forming alliances with any that would have a vampire as an ally. Then I put actions to words and went looking for a wolf pack. It took some time to find a community of werewolves somewhere in the forests of what would one day be Belize, though at the time I had no idea where we were. These were not like the werewolves that might one day exist in the 21st century. Those werewolves were hunted creatures, well learned at hiding and misdirecting. These ones had never been prey and had built an actual town for themselves. There was suspicion and caution as I approached with a group of my people. Guards stopped us from actually entering the town, staring at us before one spoke up. "The fuck you doing here?" "We ain't taking in strays." I smile politely as I reply, "I wish to speak with your alpha. Will you alert him of our presence?" The guard bared his teeth in a sneer. "They know you're here, be a pretty shitty alpha if they didn't. But you don't smell like wolves. The ones behind you smell like death, and you just smell fucking weird." I just continued to smile politely, even as my disciples shifted about behind me, grumbling more on my behalf than their own at the perceived insult. I didn't bother saying another word to the guard, content to wait patiently until the alpha finished with whatever he was doing and approached. I only had to wait about 10 minutes before discovering that my own sexist thoughts had gotten the better of me. The confident woman who approached was clearly the alpha of this pack, despite my assumptions at it being a male and the way the guard had let me continue to believe that. She was tall and muscled, the perfect image of an Amazonian warrior as she took in me and my people with a calculating gaze. I grinned at the idea that she might be as intelligent as she was strong. Eventually she spoke, "And who are you?" Her gaze was focused on me when she asked that, so I put on my best disarming smile and stepped forward to respond. Gesturing to those behind me, I replied with, "My disciples call me the Master." She glanced at those disciples for a moment before looking back at me, the corner of her mouth slightly turning up as she snarked back, "And what should I call you?" I grin at the public display of defiance and dominance, her subtle way of telling me she would never call me Master. Oh yes, there was a fiery intelligence to this one. You? You may call me Vali. I would be incredibly insulted if any of your people dared use that name though. Her eyes sparkled and I could tell she was enjoying our byplay almost as much as I was. And then of course the idiot guard had to step in and ruin it, sneering once more as he spoke up. "And why's that Vali?" he said, drawling the name out to be as insulting as possible. Before anyone could possibly react, I was in front of him, my hand curled around his throat as I lifted his choking form off the ground easily. "Because unlike your beautiful alpha, you are not worthy of it," I hissed out, knowing that everyone around me had tensed up but none had reacted. Before things could devolve further, I let the insulting wolf drop to the ground at my feet and blurred back to my previous spot before the alpha. There was more caution in her stance had become guarded as she stared at me with wary eyes. Eventually though she spoke again, "Why are you and your disciples here?" I smiled. "I am teaching my children about those who have come before us. You see, we are a rather new species to the world. I started out as a werewolf and my disciples started out as human. We have ascended to something more." This caused the female alpha's eyes to narrow as she stared at me. I could tell where her thoughts were going and her words a moment later merely confirmed it. "And are you here to ascend us then?" It was clear from her tone that she didn't see much value in the idea of becoming like my disciples. I chuckle in response and shake my head to allay her fears. "No, I cannot. I am a special case, only humans can be turned." Considering her and everyone here would be long dead by the time I'd be able to actually turn werewolves, I saw no reason to tell the truth, and no possible harm in lying. She and those of her pack standing behind her relaxed visibly, though I did note a few disappointed faces. I kept my smile up as I continued where I'd left off. "I've brought my disciples here, because I wish to tell you of my intent to take control of an area both near and far from here." Once again her eyes narrow and she becomes agitated at the idea of losing territory. "And what is that supposed to mean?" I smile and pull out a rolled-up large piece of parchment. Unfurling it, I crouched and let it roll across the ground. The alpha crouched as well on her end, staring at it with some confusion. Her confusion was justified though, as I'd basically drawn a very rudimentary map of the Americas and that sort of scale wasn't something anyone in this time period was usually called to. "Think in." She tried anyways, staring at it for several long moments before frowning and shaking her head. "Explain." She finally stated crisply, clearly not enjoying being forced to admit she needed help. I grinned and did so. "This is the landmass we are all standing on right now. On either side are very large bodies of water, almost impossible to cross with how large and deep they are." I pointed at where we now stood in the small tendril of land that connected the Americas. "This is where we are right now. Your pack holds a very pivotal position, the choke point that connects these two larger masses of land together." I looked up to see her nodding slowly, her brow furrowed. She understood, but seemed to be doubting given how small their land looked compared to the larger pieces. I just smile and continue, pointing at the entirety of South America now. "This will be where my people will settle. Over the next hundreds and hundreds of winters we will build a hidden empire." At this her eyes flashed up to mine. "Hundreds and hundreds of winters? No one lasts that long." I just chuckle. "Did I not mention that? I and my people do not age and we do not die of natural causes. We will be here 1,000 winters from now. That is 10 hundreds. All of those here have already seen 100 winters." Her jaws clenched as she comprehended the meaning of that, before eventually she spoke again. "Then why bother approaching us? Your empire will be here long after we are gone." I grin and nod. "True, but your descendants, those born of your children's children's children and so on, will still be there, if you ally with us now. While we may live far apart by your standards, it takes one of my disciples less than a day to get from our territory to yours. I am offering a hand of friendship, so that 1,000 years from now your pack will still be here, even if you are personally not. It is called a legacy. What you leave behind after you are gone." She grunts, mulling over what I was saying before eventually repeating my own words. Legacy, eh? I like the sound of that. Fine, you have an alliance. I grinned wider now, enjoying the ease of it. Werewolves were so much easier to work with than humans would be in the 21st century. Excellent. As you raise your young, teach them of us. Tell them this, the vampires to the south can be trusted. There may come a time when there are those in the north and across the seas who would hunt you. If that day ever comes, you must make sure your descendants know that they can call on us. She nods jerkily and stands. I roll up my map and do the same, putting it away and holding out a hand. She looks at it for a long moment before stepping in and grasping the inside of my arm. I grasp hers back and we exchange equally wolfish grins. A moment passes and she releases me from her grasp. Without another word, I and my disciples flash away from the werewolf town. This would continue for the next few decades, as we hunted down every wolf pack in the land between North and South America. Most had never met a vampire, as most of the vampires my siblings had turned were still across the sea. They ate up what I had to say and I formed alliances with at least 50 werewolf packs. By the time vampires not sired to me arrived in the Americas, the wolves allied with me would have a network connected by my fast-moving disciples. Most of my disciples and their own children remained in the south, building the shadow empire I'd spoken of. The humans in the area would be allowed to grow relatively unhindered, but my disciples would infiltrate their communities as time went on and help things along. South America would grow to appear what it was in the 21st century, but behind the scenes it would be a haven for vampires, a hidden kingdom. Inevitably, I was forced to make a decision as time went on. The next doppelganger, Katerina Petrova, would be found by my siblings in 1492. If left to their own devices, they would let her escape and turn herself into a vampire, leaving us to wait another 5 centuries for the next one. I'd probably have been better off leaving sooner, but I'd gotten so focused on my work and my empire over the last few centuries. Still, it was time for me to make my way to the old world and seek out my siblings so that I could make sure this damnable curse was finally lifted and I regained my full strength. My people were secure in their knowledge of my plans, and our organization had laid the framework for the hidden world of vampires that would control South America for the next several centuries. They would be fine without me for a century or two, and I would enjoy the break from managing the lot of them. 1453 AD. I let out a snarl as I flexed my body and slid around the frantic stab of another Ottoman spearman, grasping the haft of his weapon with one hand and repositioning it before impaling the foolish human upon the blunt end. Growling in anger, my fangs bared and eyes blood-red as I looked at the Ottoman soldiers warily circling me, I considered how I'd ended up in this position. I'd arrived in Europe in 1450, figuring that 42 years would be more than enough time to locate my siblings and help make sure Klaus broke this silly curse 500 years early. I made landfall in Constantinople, basically the only city name I'd recognized when chartering passage. I had considered bringing along some of my followers, but they were needed in my blossoming kingdom, and it wasn't like I required bodyguards given my immortality. So I'd come alone to this new city and charmed my way through where I could and used compulsion where charm failed. I had enjoyed the last 3 years in Constantinople, taking my time exploring everything the city had to offer both in its slums and in its palaces. Being an immortal mind-controlling monster had its perks after all. Unfortunately, I'd made the mistake of sticking around too long, and hadn't known what was coming as I didn't really pay attention to the politics and news. I hadn't even realized there was a siege going on until 3 weeks into it. As I stared down the group of Ottoman soldiers I was facing off with, I was forced to admit that I needed to learn to pay better attention to what the humans around me were up to. I truly did not appreciate being blindsided by a mortal war. I especially didn't enjoy being blindsided while I'd been enjoying the most beautiful noblewoman I'd been able to find in Constantinople. I was going to kill every single soldier I ran into on my way out of this wretched doomed city. That plan was almost immediately axed by the sudden appearance of a vampire I was shockingly familiar with. I stared on incredulously as Sage, the red head that would wait 900 years to reunite with Finn, stood before me in Ottoman armor. She'd blurred into the area with clear vampire speed, and the soldiers that had been circling me immediately backed away in deference to her. I gaped at her. For the first time in centuries I was outright shocked, even more so than when angry Ottomans had barged into the bedroom while I was feeding and fucking my latest conquest. I'd been less shocked and more angry at the interruption. With this, I wasn't sure how to react at first. As I stood indecisive for a few moments, Sage gestured sharply and the soldiers dispersed, leaving her and I as the only souls in the empty marketplace. I cocked an eyebrow at that and smiled slightly. I could work with this. Straightening up and dropping from a visible battle stance, I eyed her up and down before speaking. I did not know that the Ottomans took women into their armies as more than camp followers. She grinned in response. They do when you show you can outfight and outdrink entire legions. The Sultan in particular greatly appreciates my service. I smirk slowly. I'm sure he does. And I can see her face color slightly as she recognizes the verbal trap she'd walked into and the insult I'd dealt her. She clenches her jaw and draws a sword, causing me to sigh as I draw my own from my back. It is a replica of the one I'd grown up with, and I hold it loosely as I try to keep things from devolving into a fight that would force me to reveal my hand too early. Is this truly necessary? You intend to fight one of your own kind on behalf of the food? I asked curiously, frowning at her apparent loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. She seemed taken aback by that idea, and considered for a long moment before shaking her head. I swore to the Sultan that I would help him take Constantinople, and I take my oaths seriously. Here she paused, as if considering an idea before grinning mischievously. You clearly value your life, so what say you to a deal? We will fight, and when you lose you will serve me for 5 years in exchange for your life. I raise both eyebrows at her confidence and quirk the corner of my mouth up as I stare at her. And what happens if I win? She actually laughs at the idea of that before smiling. On the small chance that you somehow win, then you will be free to go. I will make sure the Sultan's armies let you pass. I shake my head as soon as she's finished speaking, grinning wickedly now. Now that doesn't sound like a fair trade at all. I think if I best you I should get the same as you. 5 years of service in exchange for your life. She just grins and rolls her eyes, falling into a combat stance and holding up her sword. Fine, I accept those terms. Shall we begin? I'm looking forward to teaching you some manners. I could have played at sword fighting with her a bit, made it seem as if I was weaker than I was, but to be honest I just didn't feel like pretending. As she was drawling out manners I flashed forward, appearing behind her as my sword sprouted from her chest, impaling her through as my hand gripped her thick red locks and pulled her head back. Leaning in as she choked on her own blood I placed my lips beside her ear and grinned, murmuring to her, "We'll talk more when you wake up, darling." With that said I used my grip on her hair to violently twist her head, breaking her neck easily. Moving with the same blurry speed I'd just shown, I stripped her of her armor and weapon, both clearly supplied by the Ottomans, before hefting her onto my shoulder and leaving Constantinople behind. I only stopped once I was sure I was miles away from the city and the fighting. Finding a tree I plopped her down so she was sitting against it and began cleaning my blade of her blood while I waited. It didn't take long for her to wake up, and when she did it was with a start, frantic eyes tracking around her before landing on me. I raised an eyebrow at her, still only half done with wiping my blade clean. She clearly wasn't very used to a broken neck. I spoke up before she could make a decision on what to do next. Now. Then I think we got off on the wrong foot. Based on your confidence I assume you are rather old compared to most vampires. Unfortunately for you I knew the original family when they were still human, and I can say without a doubt that I was the first they turned after they became monsters. Sage's eyes are wide as she stares at me, taking in my easy lie. The first part was even true. I had known the original family when they were still human. I smile and continue before she can really get her equilibrium back. You told me you take oaths seriously. And I was promised 5 years of service. She seemed to mull those over for a long moment, before nodding and finally finding her voice. Aye, that was the deal. I am sworn to you for 5 years, no more. I smirk. While I trust your word, I'm not one to take anything at face value. In a moment I'm kneeling in front of her, grasping the sides of her head and locking gazes as I initiated compulsion. You will do as I say when I say it. You actually want to do as I say to fulfill your obligation to me. You will feel compelled to tell me what's on your mind, and you will always be honest with me when I ask you a question. The idea of attacking me will make you feel guilty given how honorable I've been with you. You will not remember me compelling you until I tell you to. I release her and flash back to my original spot, watching as her pupils return to their original size and she blinks, looking dazed for a moment before looking to me and getting to her feet slowly. Right then, I suppose introductions are in order, yeah? I'm Sage. I grin at that. My followers call me Master. You may do the same. This caused a scowl to form on her face, but she nodded reluctantly. Very well, Master. What next? I hummed for a moment before looking at the bloody hole in her shirt, where my sword had pierced her. We find a village and get a bite to eat, a bath, and new clothes for you in that order. I need you at full strength if you're going to help me hunt down the originals. She immediately blurts out what's on her mind as my compulsion ordered her to. I'm all for finding them. Klaus has the love of my life in a coffin with a dagger in his chest, and I've been working on freeing him for 3.5 centuries. You must know him, Finn Mikaelson? I grin. Ah yes, Finn the eldest. You will be happy to know I have no problems with Finn. You may have him when we find them. Klaus and Rebecca, those are the ones I want. She nods in easy agreement. Of course she does. I'm leveraging knowledge I shouldn't even have heavily here, and I know exactly how much she hates Klaus and Rebecca, and how much they hate her. Smiling, I beckon for her to follow, and she does. Hours later, once we were far enough away from Constantinople and the human armies surrounding it, I lead her into a village and talk my way into a home with a delicious family of 5. I left her to her bath while I enjoyed the mother, sipping her blood like a fine wine as I waited for my companion to finish up. Eventually, though, I grew impatient as time went on and went looking for her. I found that she'd drifted off in the tub of warm water she'd been cleaning off in, head lulled back. I couldn't help myself. I had to know if and what she was dreaming. Stepping up behind her, I knelt and placed my hands on her head carefully before delving into her mind. I'd used this with my disciples many times, letting them report to me using their memories because it was quicker than listening to them drone on. It was a privilege extended only to those I'd personally turned, but Sage was quite a special circumstance. I found her dreaming of my family. I assumed this was one of her fonder memories with Finn, and I was proven right as I watched them spend the night together. Eventually he had to leave her to return to his family, and as she watched him go, I stepped forward from the shadows and spoke. You truly do care for him, don't you? She whirled around instantly and her eyes widened as she took me in. A moment later the dream ended as she woke up, and I grinned as I straightened from my crouch, watching as she turned over in the tub of water to stare up at me with a frown. Eventually she spoke with an accusatory tone. Some would say that it is rude to intrude on a girl's private thoughts, you know. I smirked down at her, both of us very aware of my proximity to her as I respond. Others would argue that as the master in this relationship, I own all that you have to offer, mind, body, and soul. I could see it in the way her eyes slowly moved from mine down the length of my body before coming to a stop on my covered crotch. As she reached forward slowly and fished out my hardening cock, placing her lips around the tip and slowly beginning to suck me off, I knew that it was mostly the result of my earlier compulsion. If not for that, she would have argued as much as possible that the service to me should be restricted to her fighting abilities. This wasn't out of loyalty to Finn, of course, as I knew she was just as aroused as I was. But she was not inherently a submissive woman. She was strong-willed and much preferred dominance over submission. Unfortunately for her, so did I, and thus she found herself on her knees before me. At least she'd enjoy herself. I grinned as I placed a hand in her beautiful flowing red hair, gripping it lightly as she took more and more of my length in her mouth, her plump lips forming delightful suction around the circumference of my cock. I let out a low hiss of pleasure as she worked me over, murmuring out, "That's a good girl," only to have her growl playfully and nip at my sensitive skin. In response, I gripped her hair with both hands and took control, beginning to slowly saw in and out of her throat with my now very hard cock. She opened her mouth wide and let me do as I would, completely submissive in her behavior as I began to fuck her throat. I enjoyed the dominance for several long minutes, having a powerful, confident woman like Sage on her knees before me, submitting to my every whim. Well, it was probably my largest kink. With a sudden growl, I pulled free of her throat and dragged her out of the tub. A moment later, both of us slamming into a nearby wall in a spurt of vamp speed, her front pressed against the wall and her back pressed against me as I breathed in her scent and guided my length into her wet and ready sex from behind. She gasped at the sudden movement and moaned as I filled her up, sheathing myself within her for one long moment before beginning to truly fuck her into the wall. Our coupling became rough and violent, and by the time we were done, the house we'd started in was no longer standing, and we were in a field a mile away, lying beside one another. At some point my clothing had been torn off, somewhere between the 5th or 6th go at it. I'd found a vampire as insatiable as I was. Almost as long-lasting as well, I couldn't help but add, grinning as I looked over at an unconscious Sage, completely conked out from the dozen-plus rounds of pure primal fucking. Reaching over, I pet her red hair slowly and cursed my inner shipper. She'd always belong with Finn in my mind, and given that I intended to keep him alive, they'd one day be reunited. Still, I'd have all eternity to convince him that spit-roasting a woman was a fantastic way for brothers to bond. Something told me I'd have Sage's help in that as well.
Hey there, novel lovers. I know it's not the usual thing, but if you enjoy what you're hearing, please like and subscribe. Okay, shameless plug over. Now, let's get back to the listening.
1493 AD. I'd fucked up. Gotten too cocky, too complacent, and once again failed when I needed to succeed. I could partially blame things on Sage, given how she'd proven to be such a distraction over the last few decades. To be fair to her though, I'd never told her we were on a deadline, and as I stared at the diary I'd taken as a whim off of a beautiful young woman I'd fed on, I had to face the truth. It was 1493 and I'd completely missed the window for finding my siblings and making sure the curse was broken 500 years early. It was entirely my fault, no matter how much I wished I could blame Sage. I'd allowed myself to be distracted by her little games as we'd hunted for my siblings, who had clearly learned how to hide very well over the last 5 centuries of running from Michael. After her 5 years of service were up, she'd stuck around anyways because of course we had a common goal and I'd promised to help her free Finn. But she had this insatiable need to make bets and deals and wagers to keep life interesting, and I found myself investing far more time and energy into winning them, usually by cheating, than I should have. If I'd told her from the start that we had a time limit, that we had only 40 years to find the originals, she would probably have been more focused on the task at hand. But at first I'd been unwilling to tell her more than she needed to know, and then I'd been too caught up in her games to notice how time had passed. It didn't help that I'd focused all of my considerable resources on the Americas and left Europe alone. I'd gone into this situation blind from the start, ended up blindsided by a human war for my trouble, and then been unable to locate my family because I had no assets in Europe. I'd thought I could handle it by word of mouth, because how hard could it possibly be to find a family of blood-sucking monsters? What I'd failed to take into account properly was that my siblings weren't just lounging about Europe lording their immortality and power over the puny humans. They weren't somewhere visible where they held a throne. They'd been on the run from Michael for the last several centuries and they'd gotten very good at covering their tracks from others. As I considered all of this and the number of ways I'd screwed the pooch, Sage came to stand beside me, placing her hand on my shoulder and glancing down at the letter with a bit of interest. "You've been standing there staring at this thing for like 15 minutes now. Bad news?" I nodded mechanically, speaking softly. "I'm too late. The chance has passed me by now." She frowned, brow furrowing in confusion as she shook her head. "Too late for what?" Without even considering, I told her exactly what I was thinking about, my family. I needed to find them before 1492. Now it is 1493. Beside me, Sage's eyes widen. "What do you mean by your family? You said you were hunting the originals." It was the accusatory tone in her voice as well as the volume that finally drew my attention and made me realize just what I'd done. In a moment I was holding Sage in my arms, one hand on the back of her neck gripping tightly and the other resting on her waist. To unsuspecting eyes we seemed to be sharing an intimate moment, but Sage knew better. I could tell from the way that she immediately tensed up that she knew escape was not an option and how easy it would be for me to harm her in this position. Her body was frozen and I could see her quivering as I contemplated my own stupidity for ruining what had been a rather fun distraction. Still, this was for the best. It was time for us to part ways and for Sage to move on from me. She had a life to live and things to do that would preserve the future so that I could then fuck it up more down the line. Even as I was thinking these things I realized her arm was ramrod straight and shaking. Glancing down, I raised an eyebrow to find she had a knife poised to slip into my heart. Nothing but herself was stopping her from doing it either. She was beginning to grow frantic now as a single tear fell from her eye. Why can't I stab you?" "That would be the compulsion, darling," I said, not being able to help the evil grin as she began to shake even more severely. Still, she deserved better than this. Locking gazes I began to compel her easily. "Shoo, relax, sweetheart." A moment later the dagger in her hand clattered to the ground as she visibly calmed down. I smiled and continued to speak in that low voice. Her eyes dilated as she listened to everything I had to say and repeated it back word for word. "You will remember how we met differently. I was not a vampire yet, just a scared young man trying to escape a squad of soldiers. You took pity on me and bade them to leave me to you before taking me and turning me. We've spent the last few decades searching for the originals because of your love for Finn, but we've found nothing. You taught me all I know about being a vampire, but now it's time for you to cut me loose. I've grown attached and you've just finished telling me that we're parting ways. You will not remember this compulsion, and when I'm finished speaking and release you, you will leave." At that I fell silent and let her go, stepping back and watching as the compulsion took effect. A moment later she was gone. In the end it was better this way. Still, now I was alone once more, and I wasn't in the right frame of mind to return to my people. I was more likely to act irrationally given the mood I was in. I'd spend a bit more time on this side of the planet, no more than a century more, and then head back. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci was supposed to be alive around this time, right? Hopefully I'd have an easier time finding him than finding my wayward siblings, or I'd end up being too late again. 1522 AD. It figured that the moment I stopped hunting my siblings and started having fun, I would run into Klaus. I'd compelled my way into this party, looking for a potential female friend to enjoy for the evening. Immediately I lucked out and noticed a beautiful set of twins. Centuries and I had never had twins in my bed. I was ready to make a move on the pair when I noticed my brother talking with the host of the event. I immediately moved to where I wouldn't be visible before studying Klaus carefully. So soon after Katarina's escape, Elijah was probably daggered in a coffin for the time being to pay for his failure. But Klaus never daggered everyone at once, meaning that at least one of the others was around here somewhere. A moment later I found Rebecca with a group of gentlemen suitors surrounding her, all attempting to do their best to woo and court her. I kept looking but didn't find Cole, and I felt fairly confident that Klaus wasn't dumb enough to try to handle both Rebecca and Cole at the same time without Elijah. Which meant it was just my older brother and my little sister. Deciding that said sister was distracted enough, I turned my attention back to Klaus, to find the twins I'd been eyeing earlier on each of his arms. I had to stifle laughter at that. Klaus and I were more alike than I'd like to admit it seemed. Watching the three of them more closely now, I noticed the way the girls' eyes wandered. Specifically, I noted the way their eyes kept landing on the pulse of the humans around them. It seemed Klaus had been naughty and turned the pair of them very recently. Slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. I couldn't help myself, and really, it was about time for a family reunion between two bastard brothers, was it not? Eventually Klaus broke away from his beautiful pair of ladies once again to schmooze with some important official, and that's when I moved in. Offering both girls drinks, I began smooth-talking both of them, making my intention to seduce them together incredibly obvious. It was obvious that the only reason they humored me was because they both saw a chance at a quick bite to eat once they let me get them alone. Still, whatever worked was fine by me. As we chatted and they let me slowly coax them out into the mostly empty garden, I labeled the two of them as good twin and evil twin in my mind. Better terms for it might have been timid twin and outgoing twin. Eventually we were sat on a bench, each of them allowed me to kiss them before going in for the kill, nuzzling my neck together. Subtly I leaned my head back, exposing my throat to both of them. They immediately vamped out, eyes going red and fangs coming down. They even reared back in unison as they moved to take bites out of the side of my neck. Unfortunately for both of them, I was more than ready for them, and each found my iron grip curling into their hair, holding them fast just out of reach of my skin. I grinned, giving both of them a raised eyebrow before speaking. "Come now, girls. Shouldn't we save the biting for the bedroom?" Curious to see how they'd react now, I released my grip on their hair. Timid twin immediately shifted as far away from me as the bench would allow her, fear etched across her face. Outgoing twin though sidled up against me, intensely curious now as she stared at me before voicing what was on her mind. "Who are you? You should know we have a suitor and he isn't the sharing type." I laugh at that, smirking at her as I answered, "Yes, I know your suitor. Considering he's my brother, I'm quite sure he won't mind me stealing a small bit of your time." Before outgoing twin could react to that reveal, Klaus finally came looking for his vamp babies. As he caught his first glimpse of us, my face was initially hidden from view. He sounded like a mix of exasperated and amused as he called out, "Loves, I know you both like playing with your food, but what have I told you about leading mortals along?" It was at the end of this phrase that he got close enough to see my own amused face looking back at him, causing him to stumble as his eyes widened in shock. I filled the suddenly awkward silence after a few moments, drawing the twins close with an arm around each of their shoulders and smirking that smirk only he and I could pull off properly. "Hello, brother. Long time no see." I watched so many emotions flicker across Klaus' face in the span of a minute that I honestly thought he would break right then. But eventually he settled on humored, a grin stretching across his face as he wagged his finger at me. Even after 5 centuries, you're still borrowing my playthings without asking, brother. I laughed in response and pushed both of the twins off the bench towards him. He caught them with a hand on each shoulder, and I watched as he compelled them both back to whatever rooms he'd put them up in. Once the baby vamps were gone, I stood and squared off with my brother, ready for him to attack me now that we were alone. Instead, he stepped forward and hugged me before leaning back and looking me over. Brother, you have been missed. When you just vanished one day, we all feared the worst. I myself worried that our father had killed you first before he killed our mother. His act was almost shameful in its false sincerity, though I had to remind myself that I had a great deal of information he had no idea of knowing I knew. Nodding somberly, I responded, Father found me only a few decades after I left. I know Mother is dead. He accused you of killing her, though. The smile falls from Klaus' face and he looks into my eyes for a long moment before asking, You don't believe that, do you? I smile in reply and shake my head. Of course not, brother. If I'd believed him, I would have agreed to help him hunt you and our siblings down. He did not take kindly to my denying him. Klaus grinned in response, clasping a hand on my shoulder. Good, that's good. Brother, you must come back to my temporary abode for the night. We have much to talk about, and those twins will be waiting for us. Rebecca probably won't show up again until morn, but you two will have plenty of time to catch up tomorrow. Given you're back, I assume you intend to stick around for a while. I grinned back before nodding as I let him lead me back towards wherever he's currently staying. I could be persuaded to stay for a while. I look forward to seeing Elijah, Cole, and Finn as well, of course. We stop talking for a moment as we blur across the city to get where we need to be. Once we arrive, Klaus gives me an indecipherable look that I know the true meaning of all too well and says, Of course. Let me get us drinks and then we can catch up. I nod and glance around the room he'd left me in. A bookshelf is what I choose to focus my attention on as I wait for him to return, reading the spines along the shelves. It only takes Klaus a minute to locate his extra silver daggers and his vial of white oak ash. I saw his plan coming a mile away, of course. I'd been expecting this to be his reaction to my abandonment for centuries now. As soon as I resolved to break off from my family, I knew how he'd perceive it. So when he flashed up behind me and reached around to stab me with the dagger in the heart, I let it happen, choking out in pain and pretending to collapse, letting him catch me in his arms and slowly lower me to the ground. He looked down on me with his true feelings finally showing, the rage and anguish warring across his features as he finally let himself speak freely, his voice tinged with betrayal and rage. You betrayed and abandoned your family for 500 years, brother. You will sleep for at least half of that before I even consider removing this dagger. He hissed these words out as I stared up at him with just the right mixture of betrayal and fear in my face. But I knew I wasn't turning gray as he expected, and I could see the way his anger was slowly turning to confusion. I knew I wouldn't be getting away just on my amazing acting skills for much longer, so reaching up in a blur of speed, I pulled the dagger from my breast and slammed it into the side of Klaus' throat. He coughed up blood almost immediately as he fell back in surprise, and then I was on him, pushing him back onto the floor and pulling the dagger free from the side of his neck only to drive it through the front, driving the tip into the wood beneath him and pinning him to the floor for a few moments. I stood as he struggled with it, looking down on him for a long moment even as his hands grasped the handle of the dagger and began to pull. Moving around him carefully, I suddenly kicked him in the head hard enough to snap his neck almost instantly. Smiling grimly down at his unconscious form, I couldn't help one final comment. I'm going to go find that drink now, dear brother. When Klaus did finally wake up, I was sitting across from him in a chair, drinking straight from a bottle of scotch. I'd placed his boneless body in a chair of his own, and now we were staring at each other from our respective seats. Eventually I sighed and put the bottle down. I'm sure you're figuring it out as I speak, but to make it easy I'll spell it out for you. You were Mother's first indiscretion and I was her second. Unlike the rest of our siblings, we're full-blood brothers and also both hybrids. I saw him take this in and saw his reluctant acceptance of it as the truth. After all, the dagger had done nothing to me, had it not? My explanation fit perfectly with the evidence at hand. His tone was sullen when he spoke again, and yet, even though you clearly knew the truth, you still ran away. You left your own blood behind. His accusatory tone made me smile in a self-deprecating way. Come now, brother, even with our blood status I was always the odd one out. Even more so than Cole or Finn, I was the one separated from the family. He fires back fast at that. That was your doing and yours alone, Vali. From my earliest memories I can recall trying to build bonds of brotherhood with you. You turned me away in favor of learning all you could at the feet of Michael. I nod in acceptance of the accusation before proceeding to lie my ass off. You're right. I learned too early what our mother had done. One of my earliest memories is of our true father sneaking in to visit us. I was awake but you were not. Our mother interrupted before I could wake you, but not before the werewolf alpha who'd truly parented us told me the truth. Based off of mother's reaction I knew it was not a falsehood. She swore me to secrecy, told me that Michael's wrath would ruin our family. I was only 6, brother. Of course I agreed. Klaus took this in, though whether he believed it or not I couldn't tell. Eventually, though, he rejoined the conversation. So you pulled away from your siblings and cozied up with the man you knew was not your father out of fear and cowardice. I laughed at that. Call it what you will, brother. You sought his approval and affection as strongly as I did. The fact that I did so out of fear for a cruel man and you did so out of misplaced love for a man who wasn't even your father is neither here nor there. The fact remains, the weak will always seek shelter with the strong. Once we became strong, we no longer needed that shelter, and strength is all I've ever sought. Klaus nodded slowly at that, but continues to frown. Why did you return now, Vali? What have you been doing for the last 500 years? I sigh and lean back in my chair. I came looking for you because I heard from a particularly gifted witch that the new doppelganger had been born. I did not escape mother's curse, dear brother. She placed it on our bloodline, not just you. I have just as much interest in seeing the curse broken. As soon as I was told the window of time was open, I came to the old world to try and find you and our siblings. But the window of time is gone, isn't it? The girl is dead, and given that the curse remains in place, it was not by your hand, was it? Klaus grimaces at that, his jaw clenching as he broods for a moment before finally speaking up. She's not just dead, she turned herself just to escape. And she took the moonstone mother used to bind the curse as well. She's been in the wind since 1492. I returned the grimace with one of my own, though it was false given I'd already known that, as I expected. Then it is time for me to take my leave of the old world. As I stand, Klaus does the same, looking angered now. You would leave again then, brother? After finally revealing that you are the only true family I have left. With a smile, I step in and clasp the back of Klaus' neck with my hand, looking into his eyes. I cannot stay here, Klaus. I have work to do in the new world, preparations to make and plans to further. Michael must die, Klaus, and even if it takes me another 400 years I will find a way to put him down. Until then I must keep my distance so he does not know I am on your side. Releasing him as he digested this particular confession, I stepped away before adding one last thing. And Klaus, though they may be nothing more than our half-siblings, we will never truly be a family until you stop treating our brothers and sister like playthings that you can put in boxes when you don't want to deal with them. There will come a time when Michael is dead and this curse is broken that I will come for the white oak daggers. When that time comes, we will throw them into the ocean together as a true family. I didn't bother waiting for his response. He'd have 400+ years to consider my words, and for now, it was time for me to move on once more. I couldn't help thinking rather sarcastically that Rebecca was sure to be devastated she missed me. 1530 AD. I'd originally intended to spend a longer amount of time in Europe, but meeting with Klaus again had reaffirmed what was important to me. My empire back in the Americas needed my guidance, and I could no longer ignore it, especially when vampires created by my siblings had probably already made their way over to the New World, and I had no intention of letting them kill the wolf packs I'd allied with. In the end, I managed to compel my way onto a conquistador ship bound for what would one day become Brazil. From there, I managed reconnected with my disciples along the communication network I'd established with them. In my absence, my power base had grown dramatically. As I'd thought, some vampires had arrived from the old world. They'd found a vampire hierarchy already in place, and most had settled for following the rules I'd put in place, it seemed. Mostly, I was surprised to learn that all 49 of my original disciples were still accounted for. I'd been expecting to lose at least 1 or 2 over the decades I'd been gone, but I suppose there was something to be said for spending 120 years training them specifically in how to be vampires. Pleased that while I'd been failing overseas, my children had been succeeding, I sought out the one I'd left in charge, the elder sister of the girl I'd spared so long ago. Her loyalty had been unquestionable after I spared her only remaining family, but I'd left nothing to chance, layering numerous compulsions to make sure she stepped not a toe out of line while I was gone. I found her in a meeting with unfamiliar vampires who I gave barely a glance as I strode in with arms spread. "Darling Ravia, it has been too long." As soon as she saw me, Ravia was across the room, slamming into my arms and hugging me in a blur of vamp speed. I chuckled and returned the hug for a moment before holding her at arm's length. I smiled at her as I watched her eyes clear up almost imperceptibly, the compulsions I'd layered onto her fading away in my presence as I'd commanded, and she smiled back shyly before ducking her head in deference to me. "Thank you for your hard work, my dear, it was much appreciated." I pet her hair and grinned at the way she leaned into my hand, before I stepped past her towards the table, taking in those who sat around it. They were mostly staring at Ravia and I with something akin to confusion and shock. It was more than understandable considering that part of the compulsions I'd placed on Ravia had changed her shy, introverted personality into that of a charismatic leader. Now she trailed behind me carefully and kept her gaze down, having reverted to her naturally shy personality. It was clearly a jarring change for the people she'd just been talking to, and I sighed as I fell into her seat at the end of the table and brought my hands together with a smile on my face. "Are you going to introduce our guests to me, dear Ravia?" She blinks before nodding. "Ah, of course, master. These are some of our kin from across the seas. They arrived a few months ago, and upon finding our community already in place, they petitioned for membership. They have followed our rules well enough, but last week they discovered the werewolves to the north and felt compelled to make sure I was aware of the threat they posed to us." I grin at that. "I see. Well, as you may have guessed, I am the master. I'm sure you've heard of me." I can see the recognition in their eyes at that. They've clearly been told of me. Most seem appropriately in awe, if not at least cautiously respectful, but there's an idiot in every group. This was proven a moment later when one of those at the table scoffed and spoke up. "So you're the master everyone's been gushing about. You don't look like much." Ravia almost immediately moved to kill him, but I stopped her with a hand and let out a laugh before standing to get a good look at my naysayer. The smile that had been growing on my face actually froze before turning into a frown as I took in the face of a familiar man. "I can't help but satisfy my curiosity. And your name is?" He had an easy grin on his face that spoke of confidence not in himself, but in another as he replied, "Name's Trevor, but it's not me you should be worried about. You see, Mary over there is over 300 years over. She was turned by an original vampire. So you'll have to excuse me if I don't see any point in licking your boots." I looked over to where he gestured and laid eyes on what I could only assume was Mary Porter. She looked similar enough to the corpse impaled on a wall I'd seen in my past life. She also looked rather embarrassed on behalf of Trevor. I grinned as I looked around the table and found the third familiar face I'd missed. Rosemary sat there looking between Trevor, Mary, and I, and she looked just as embarrassed. Turning my attention back to Mary, the first grinned and cocked an eyebrow. "Is this true, Mary? Should I be worried about you?" I don't know if she saw something in my eyes, but she shook her head slowly before responding. "No, regardless of our ages, I have no desire to lead or usurp your community. You need to be worried about the werewolves in the north. On the full moon their bite is fatal to all of us." I smiled tightly at that. "Yes, about our ages." In a flash I'd snapped Mary's neck and then lifted Trevor into the air with a hand firmly around his throat. The vampires around the table were slow to react to speed they could barely keep track of, but eventually everyone stood abruptly in alarm. I swept my gaze over them imperiously and snarled out, "Sit down." I got an immediate response as every single one of them plopped back into their chairs with wide eyes. I smirked at that and then finally deigned to look at Trevor, whose hands were scrabbling at my wrist, attempting to remove the ironclad grip I had on his throat. "Now then, Trevor, here's what you need to know. I am over 500 years old and I do not take kindly to disrespect or threats. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically as best he could and I smiled, finally letting him drop back into his own chair and looking back at the rest of the table. Amusingly, it's Rose who speaks next, sounding disbelieving but also managing to keep a respectful tone. "Milord, how can you be over 500 years old? The first family themselves were turned at the start of the 11th century. I smirk at that. "Yes. We were." I enjoyed the shock and alarm on the faces of those around the table far too much as they took that in. Then Trevor and Rose's eyes locked over the table and a moment later they both made a run for the door. I was already expecting their little bolting action though, and before they could get 10 feet my hands closed around the scruff of their necks, pulling them back violently and tossing them onto the table in the center of the room. That's when the disciples that Ravia had subtly left to find earlier arrived to surround the table. 15 of my children each placed their iron grip on a vampire's shoulders, and I smiled as I once again walked back towards the table. I do apologize to those of you not involved in this little problem, but you seem to have fugitives amongst you. Ones who have very greatly disappointed my family. As I approached, both Rose and Trevor were rolled off of the table and brought to their feet by my people to face me. I smiled as I saw that same fear they'd had for Elijah in their eyes when they looked at me. Rose was silent, awaiting her fate with quiet dignity, but Trevor was babbling apologies that I couldn't even really understand because of his blubbering. Coming up on both of them, I raised my hands and clasped them on their shoulders, looking into their eyes. I forgive you. Rose's eyes widened in shock, but it took Trevor a full minute for the words to register, and his babbling finally died down as both of them just stared at me. I grinned and continued to talking. It wasn't your fault. It was especially not your fault, Rose, but Trevor, I understand being tricked by love. Katerina is the one who will answer for her crimes. The most you two are guilty of is being duped, and I forgive you for that. It's Trevor who eventually answers as Rose seems to be speechless still. Thank you, but Klaus won't stop hunting us on your say-so, will he? I smirk at that. Of course not. Klaus isn't nearly as forgiving as I am. But that's why you are both going to stay here with me, hidden. You and everyone in this room will take my oath and serve me. In return, I will protect you and keep you safe from my siblings for as long as is necessary. He blinks at that, but seems accepting enough of the idea. All right. What's this oath then? I grin and move my hand from his shoulder to clasp the back of his neck as I lock my eyes with his and begin the compulsion. Once I'm done with Trevor, I move to Rose, and then I move around the room easily and have much of the room oath-bound and compelled in short order. As they settle back into their seats, I smile. Now, about the reason you called this meeting in the first place. The werewolf packs to the north are mine as much as you are. I have not spent 200 years cultivating their loyalty to have vampires from the old world such as yourselves ruining that. So your first task is to watch for any of your brethren who might follow here. Point them out to my disciples, and together we will make sure that any vampire who happens to arrive in my kingdom knows the rules. Am I understood? There are nods around the room, and I smile before gesturing for my disciples to lead them out. Ravia remains behind, standing near where I'd left Mary with a broken neck, studying her as she lay there unconscious. I walk over and pull Ravia into a hug that she gratefully melts into. Kissing the top of her head, I smile down at her. Once again, you did wonderful, sweetheart. I knew I could count on you. For now, though, you are free to go. I'll handle this last one. She nods shyly and leaves in a blur even as I pull Mary up and drop her in her chair. A moment later, the woman described as an original groupie woke up with a start, gasping with wide eyes as she glanced around sharply. Her eyes fell on me and I grinned, grabbing her by the throat before she could react again. I initiated the compulsion and bound her to my oath before releasing her. She breathed slowly as the cloudiness in her eyes faded away before looking at me with wide eyes. Why, you just compelled me, didn't you? I chuckle lightly and nod. I did, yes. And yes, that does mean what you think it means. Now she looks like a blushing schoolgirl, and I grin at her for a moment more before stepping away. Anyways, as I told the rest of your friends, the werewolves are mine. I expect you and yours to protect them and make sure any vampires who follow you lot across the sea know not to break my rules. I'm sure we'll talk again soon. And then I left her there, knowing that she'd be pursuing me soon enough given her proclivities for originals. Could be a decent pastime for a year or two until I finally decided to take her to bed. 1713 AD. Elijah couldn't help but frown as they drew closer to the shore only to see a young woman waiting on the docks for them. His siblings had already had their fill of sailors, but he could easily see Klaus making an exception for a young beauty like this. However, before he could step forward and compel the girl away, she caught sight of him and smiled, stepping up and calling to him, "Lord Elijah." He froze at that, as no one in this new world should have known who he was. He felt Niklaus and Rebecca beside him even before Klaus spoke up. "Oh? Lord Elijah, is it? Did you drag admirers across the sea with you, brother?" Elijah shook his head, murmuring out, "I've never met this woman before in my life, brother." Even as said woman caught sight of his siblings as well and called out once more, "Lord Klaus, Lady Rebecca." At this point, all three of them were a bit off kilter. When they made landfall, the girl presented herself with a well-executed curtsy. "Milords, milady. I have been sent by the master to make sure your arrival in New Orleans is a pleasant one. I am at your command." Elijah raised an eyebrow, but upon seeing that his brother and sister seemed content on leaving this conversation to him, he spoke up. "Yes, well, you can start by explaining. Who is this master you speak of?" The girl smiled brightly and seemed about to respond when Niklaus spoke up, causing her to instantly fall silent. "Don't be obtuse, brother. The girl is obviously a vampire and obviously compelled. There are only 2 people in this world that could have sent her to us that aren't already here, and one of them would never announce his presence like this." Elijah focused back on the girl, having noticed the compulsion. He hadn't noticed she was a vampire though, and he could only assume Niklaus could tell by scent. Then his brother's words caught up with him and he looked at him incredulously. "Are you suggesting that our long-lost brother has set himself up as some sort of master in the old world while we've been gone?" Rebecca seemed to be catching up as well, and she scowled at the girl who'd delivered this news to her. "So instead of coming himself, Vali sends his pet to greet us." The girl immediately ducked her head. "Ah, you misunderstand, milady. I am not here just to greet you, I am here to serve you. The master has sent me because he cannot be pulled away from his current work, but he also wished to apologize for his absence. My life is yours to do with as you please, even if you wish to end it." This caused all 3 originals to just stare at her for a long moment, perhaps even considering it. Elijah was ready to step forward to keep his siblings from doing anything nasty when Rebecca took the lead, walking past both Elijah and Klaus and smiling at the girl who just offered her life to them. "Well, I suppose my wayward older brother does owe me quite the backlog of birthday gifts. I accept you into my service as my handmaiden. Come along now, the boys have already handled our luggage arrangements, and I want to hear all about what Vali has been up to for the last 700 years. With that said, Rebecca began walking away, and after giving Elijah and Klaus each deep bows, the girl straightened up and followed after their little sister. Elijah looked at Klaus with incredulity at the whole situation, and Klaus just smiled and shrugged before following the pair of women. With a sigh, Elijah did the same. XX scene breaks X. 1820 AD. Ravia walked behind Rebecca and her brothers as they followed the funeral procession. Niklaus had killed another of Rebecca's lovers, this time the governor's son, and now they were paying their respects, as ironic as that was. She heard the sound of whipping long before she laid her eyes on the young black boy her master said would one day rule New Orleans in the far future. She had no idea how it was the master knew so much about future events, but her place was not to question him. It was right that he inherently knew more than those beneath him, but even his family seemed lacking compared to him in this manner, and that confused her. If he could see the future, know the shape of things to come, why could they not? Still, it was not her place to question, merely her place to carry out his orders. As she watched, Niklaus killed the man who'd been whipping the boy, before kneeling and offering the child a place at his side. She watched as Niklaus gave him a name. Marcellus, little warrior. The boy came with them as they continued along with the funeral procession, and eventually later in the evening, Niklaus handed him off to her, so that she may give him dinner, a bath, and put him to bed. Ravia did so without complaint, knowing that the originals saw her as nothing more than a useful tool to do their bidding. And that was her purpose for the time being, one she was content with. But even still, she couldn't help but watch Marcellus as he slept, once she'd tucked him in. Smiling and leaning down, she whispered as if telling a great secret to the sleeping child. "The master says that one day you will be a king. Even though you are unaware, it must be wonderful, having the master's approval so early in life." With her words said, she left the room, not noticing when Marcellus carefully opened his eyes and stared after her in confusion. XX scene breaks X. 1820 AD, later that same year, New Orleans. Ravia watched from the shadows as the witch Celeste drank of the wine she'd laced with Elijah's blood. She knew not why the master wanted this done, but he'd told her of body jumping and possession and said that it was for the best that Celeste live forever in her original body, instead of stealing the bodies of young girls for the next few centuries. Ravia agreed, of course, because he was her master. She watched as Celeste told Elijah of Klaus' game with the humans, and she watched as Elijah left to deal with Klaus. Soon enough, the men hunting for witches entered the room, and Celeste managed to get out only one shriek before they pushed her under the water and drowned her. Ravia continued to watch as Elijah returned in a panic and screamed in anguish over his beloved's death. When Celeste came back to life in his arms, he was astonished, shocked even. When they realized Celeste was in transition, there was more shock and more anger, mostly from Celeste directed at Elijah. Ravia realized as the conversation went on that Celeste did not have a sire bond to Elijah as her master had thought might happen, meaning that she did not truly love Elijah as much as Elijah loved her. In the end, Celeste did choose to drink human blood instead of dying permanently, but the relationship between her and Elijah was forever strained as she believed he had been secretly feeding her his blood to keep her from ever leaving him through death. They would eventually part ways over this disagreement, as she believed he would not tell her the truth of the matter when he actually was speaking truth. Ironically, this had a positive effect on Elijah's relationship with Niklaus, as he believed that it was Klaus who had made sure Celeste had vampire blood in her system in a twisted way of preserving Elijah's beloved. While he didn't agree with Klaus' supposed actions, he appreciated the idea behind them even as Klaus vehemently denied having a hand in it, protesting that he really did have no idea who Celeste was. Meanwhile, Ravia stood in the shadows and smiled a small secret smile while nobody suspected a thing of her. 1864 AD Mystic Falls. I arrived in Mystic Falls on January 1st of 1864 to avoid missing the pivotal events to come. At the same time, I knew that there was still a white oak tree somewhere around here, and I didn't want to alert the founding families to my presence. So I stayed to the shadows and waited patiently, watching as Catherine Pierce arrived with Emily Bennett. I watched as she cavorted with the Salvatore brothers, leading both along like dogs. I watched as she met with George Lockwood and began plotting to fake her death at the expense of every single other vampire in the town. The night finally arrived that Catherine found herself brought low by the vervain Stefan's father had dosed him with. The vampires were being rounded up, and I watched as Pearl approached Jonathan Gilbert to ask him what was happening. As he excitedly explained what they were doing and how his invention worked, I blurred into place behind Pearl and watched as he stared at her in horror when his device pointed at her and me. "Why, you're one of them," he said, accusing Pearl of being a vampire, which to be fair she was. But I'd never liked how things had gone down for Pearl, so before she could react, I flashed up behind her and grabbed her, one arm wrapping around her waist and the other curling in her hair to pull her head back and expose her throat. I grinned viciously at Jonathan Gilbert from behind Pearl's tense body and spoke. "Your little device is pointing at me, Gilbert, and for what you and yours have done tonight, I'm taking your beloved as recompense." With that said, I very clearly vamped out, eyes turning red and fangs coming out before I bite forcibly into Pearl's exposed neck, causing a delightful shriek to come from her throat. Before Jonathan could do anything, I'd fled with her in my arms, leaving the entire vampire hunting party behind quite easily. Of course, Anna followed me as I led her into the woods with Pearl struggling in my grasp. Once I deemed us far enough away, I dropped Pearl against a tree and waited for Anna to arrive. She arrived with less than proper decorum, attempting to slam into me and get me away from her mother. I responded by catching her by the throat with my hand as she came barreling at me, and then tossing her next to her mother. I waited patiently as both women groaned and got to their feet, Pearl staring at me for several long moments before speaking. "Who are you? You do not live here, and you had no reason to throw yourself into the middle of a vampire hunt to save me. Where did you even come from?" I grin at that, even as Anna glares at me, standing by her mother seemingly content to follow Pearl's lead in this. "You may know me as the Master." I'm gratified when I see recognition in both of them at the title, though it's incredulous at best as I continue. "I'm in the area on personal business, but I saw your plight and couldn't help intervene. You do know you're a vampire, right, love? Were you truly going to let them take you so easily when you can move faster than they can track with their eyes? Leave behind this one at the same time?" Pearl looked embarrassed at me pointing out her lapse, but eventually she clenched her jaw. "While I am thankful for your intervention, I do not need to be scolded by some idiot pretending to be a myth that's several centuries old. I might have had an easier time believing you if you'd claimed you were a disciple." My grin slipped from my face and I think my eye even twitched a bit. "This was what happened when you made yourself the boogeyman, I suppose." Nothing to it then. In a flash I was in front of the two of them, my hands once more around their throats as they belatedly reacted and began trying to struggle. I initiated compulsion with Pearl first and her struggles ceased as she was put under my spell. "Believe this, my dear. I am the Master and you will serve me for the next 50 years for saving your life. You will never attack me, you will never plot against me. At the end of 50 years you and your daughter may decide to move on. When I release you, you will make your way south and seek out my people to join with my empire. Do you understand?" As she confirmed that she understood, I repeated the general gist of the compulsion with Anna, before releasing both of them. There was fear in their eyes now, and I could tell they were much more willing to believe the myths that spoke of me than they were before. Gesturing dismissively, I watched as they sped away, confident that they would do as I said. But they were not the real reason I was here, and I quickly moved on, heading for the road where the Salvatore brothers lay dead, and where Catherine would meet with George Lockwood to flee Mystical Falls. I arrived just as Catherine pulled the moonstone from her corset, and I could hear her telling George that if he ever betrayed her, she'd find him and kill him. Before she could hand over what he wanted, I appeared behind her, casually breaking her neck with one hand and snatching the valuable moonstone with the other. George took a step back in a mixture of disbelief and fear before his resolve hardening, and he clenched his jaw. That moonstone is supposed to be mine. I had a deal with her. I grin at his courage as he gestures at the unconscious vampire at my feet. Looking the moonstone over, I shake my head. I'm sorry, Mr. Lockwood, but this artifact was not hers to give away. It belongs to my family, an heirloom over 8 centuries old. I do apologize, but it will not be going to you tonight. The woman at my feet stole this long ago, and now she must pay for that theft. I stopped looking at the moonstone and stared at George Lockwood, my eyes boring into his. I hope very much that you make the right choice about associating with such trash. I saw the fear in his eyes at those words, smiling grimly as he took another involuntary step back. Still, he had some courage and managed to get out another question. You smell wrong. Given your speed and strength, I assume you to be a vampire like Catherine. But you do not smell like death as most vampires do. You smell almost alive. I grin at that and see no harm in dropping some information on the young man. That would be because I am half werewolf, Mr. Lockwood. I am a hybrid, if you will, one of two, the only ones of our kind. If ever you need help, search for the werewolves in the far south, past the Mexican Empire. My name is Vali, but I am better known as the Master. I swear this upon my immortal life, that the Lockwood werewolves will always have an ally in me so long as your family does not actively work against me. I see him mull this over as I continue. I know it may be little consolation for not obtaining the moonstone tonight, but it is the best I can offer. I can also tell you this, in 145 years I will break the curse of the sun and the moon. I can assure you that when that curse is broken, vampires will not walk unhindered in the sun. He blinks at that and at the utter sincerity in my voice and frowns. Why would you side with the werewolves over the vampires? I smile and spread my arms wide, continuing to speak as sincerely as possible. After all, everything I'm saying is the truth. I can already walk in the sun unhindered. On the other hand, my wolf form has been locked away for several centuries. My path is quite clear, wouldn't you say? He seems to accept this and the truth of my statements, nodding slowly. I would yes. Very well, Vali. I accept your deal, and I will make sure my descendants know that they can call on you. I grin and begin to reply. Wonderful, I dash, when Catherine suddenly groans, beginning to wake up. With a sigh, I kick her in the head hard enough to once more break her neck with a sickening crack. George flinches at the sound as I chuckle and reach down to pick up the limp body at my feet, draping my prize over my shoulder. Well, Mr. Lockwood, this is where we part ways. You have a good night, I say with feigned courtesy and a wicked grin, before leaving him standing alone in the middle of the road, both Katerina and the moonstone once more in my possession. 1864 AD, undisclosed location in South America. I snapped Katerina's neck again and again as we traveled back to the heart of my territory. By the time I finally allowed her to wake up, she probably had a massive headache as she took in the dreary conditions I'd set her up in. Her arms were suspended from the ceiling of a stereotypical dungeon, and she was forced to either stand on her tiptoes or let her arms stretch painfully. The lovely dress she'd been wearing had been torn away to leave her wearing nothing but undergarments. She looked quite beautiful as she struggled with the chains on her wrists, even with how disheveled our trip across continents and my treating her like a sack of potatoes had left her. Unfortunately for her, I'd had witches enchant those chains, and no vampire below the age of 700 was going to be able to break free of them. Stepping forward, my presence immediately caused her to still and turn her attentions towards me. I saw sheer terror in her eyes turn to relief as she found someone who was completely unfamiliar to her. She'd probably been expecting Klaus or Elijah or one of the dozens of other people who'd want her dead after her centuries of life. I just smile and wait patiently for her to find her voice, and eventually she does, asking the question I was expecting from her at this point. Who the bloody hell are you supposed to be? I don't answer her at first, content to step closer and circle her, studying her body from all angles. She takes that as a chance to grab hold of her chains and swing up onto them so she could launch a beautifully executed blindingly fast roundhouse kick at my head. If it had connected it might have even broke my neck, but I catch her ankle with ease and my iron grip strips her of all momentum. She stares at me with wide eyes as I smile at her wickedly, holding her leg up in one hand and running the other hand down the length of it, fingertips ghosting over her smooth skin in an intimate way that left her shivering. I considered snapping her ankle right there, but ultimately decided against it, releasing her leg and letting her bring it back down as I continued to circle her. Eventually I stopped in front of her and finally answered her question with another question. Tell me, what do you know of the Master and his disciples? She blinks at the seemingly unconnected tangent, but considering the position I have her in, she eventually answers, her voice full of contempt. It's a myth. There are old vampires who claim to be disciples of a master who created every vampire in the world. This supposed super vampire cannot be killed, but he's vanished, and it is said that his disciples await his return so that those loyal to him can take over the world. It's a vampire's take on a common myth found in most religions. She pauses for a moment, but I just smile. And what makes you so sure it's not true? She scoffs at that. I'm not saying there wasn't once a vampire who called himself the Master and spread lies to those he turned. He probably died centuries ago and his followers believed the crazy story and are patiently awaiting the return of a dead guy who's never coming back. I know he can't possibly have been what he is said to be, because I met the originals. It's not one vampire, it's a family of vampires. I nod, I see. And how do you know they're legitimate where this master is not? She frowns, because they can't be killed by a stake to the heart. One of them doesn't even need a daylight spell to walk in the sun. And they can compel normal vampires. I smile and turn away from her, walking over to a table I'd prepared for this. Running my hand over the table's contents, I heard her breath hitch as she finally focused on what sat on it. Eventually I picked up a well-made wooden stake and turned back to her. You've been incredibly helpful, Katerina Petrova. Thank you. As I walked towards her, she tried to back away, her expression turning terrified as she assumed that I was about to end her life. Please, you don't have to do this, I can still be useful to you or whoever you work for. She was practically rambling as I stopped in front of her, the stake resting casually in my hands. I just stared at her until she fell silent, staring back at me with slight whimpers escaping her throat every few moments. I smiled as I transferred the stake into one hand and reached into my pocket with the other to produce a key. Do not fret, Katerina, I am not going to kill you. With ease, I undid the shackles holding her connected to the ceiling and let her fall to the floor. She immediately scrambled away from me, but we both knew that the door to this room was locked. She was trapped in here with me as I slowly approached her. Crouching in front of her, I flipped the stake around so that the hilt was held out to her. Then I told her what I would have her do. I want you to take this stake and drive it into my heart, Katerina. Kill me and take the keys from my corpse and you will be free to leave. I had to give her points for eagerness. By the time I was saying the word leave, she'd flashed forward, taken the offered stake, and slammed it home into my chest. Her gaze was initially focused on the spot where she'd impaled me on the wooden stake, and she was panting heavily in perceived triumph. But as nothing happened, her wide eyes slowly moved from my chest up to my smiling face. Reaching out, I casually patted the top of her head and said, I think we're finally getting on the same page, Katerina. She let go of the stake abruptly and once more backed away from me, almost curled into the fetal position as she put her back against the wall and her knees up against her chest. W, who are you? W, what are you? I grin as I stand, pulling the stake from my chest easily and toss it to the side as I look down at her. My followers call me the Master, my dear Katerina, but my given name is Vali. From what I understand, you met my brother Klaus when you were still a human in the last years of the 15th century. You see, he and I share a pesky little curse that can only be broken by the sacrifice of a doppelganger. Such as yourself. These revelations seem to do a pretty good job of breaking poor little Katerina's mind as she begins hyperventilating halfway through my explanation. I could tell she wasn't going to calm down normally anytime soon, so with a sigh I reached down and pulled her up to her feet with a grip on the back of her neck. Locking gazes with her, I compelled her, Calm down, Katerina. She did so immediately, the forced calm leaving her entire body relaxed. Eventually she spoke again, Please, just kill me now. You have the moonstone, I can't be used as the doppelganger because I turned. I know Klaus wants to torture me for running. I know you probably want to do so as well, but please, I'm begging you to just kill me. I chuckle as I release her neck and caress her face with my hands. Ah. My dear Katerina, it doesn't get to be that simple. In fact, let us lay to rest such ideas of you dying too soon right now. Initiating compulsion, I order. You will never attempt to end your existence, by your own hands or any others. She repeated the words back to me and I smiled, releasing her. She stepped away, still forcibly calm as she stared at me and eventually asked, "Are you going to hurt me now?" I can't help but laugh again. No, Katerina. I'm not going to hurt you. Pain is my brother's forte, wouldn't you say? I have other methods of tearing you down and building you into what I want. Come here. She did so slowly with no compulsion on my part, stepping into my grasp of her own volition. Once more I locked gazes and compelled her. When I touch you, you will feel only pleasure, Katerina. Every sensation that you experience because of me will be amplified by a factor of 10. When I tell you to, you will climax instantly. If you are ever more than 100 feet from me, you will feel as if the sun is burning you up. You will not remember this compulsion unless I allow you to. I pull free and she blinks her eyes clear before immediately blushing at the way just being in my presence is now making her feel. What did you just do to me? I don't answer with words, instead I reach up and caress her cheek with my palm. Her eyelids actually shudder as her body shivers and her legs wobble a bit. Oh gee gods, what is that? I can't help but chuckle, before leaning in and kissing her roughly, exploring her mouth with my tongue and feeling as she melted against me. She'd probably have fallen to the floor from orgasm that hit her if I hadn't caught her in my arms. That didn't really help though either, and she went through a series of pleasure-induced orgasm just from bodily contact with me. Eventually I was forced to take her from the dungeon I'd had her in and find a bed to lay her down on. She was gasping for air as she finally recovered from the contact I'd made with her body. I frowned down at her, considering things. A factor of 10 seems to have been a bit much. I couldn't help but muse aloud before leaning over her panting form and locking eyes to initiate another bout of compulsion. Let's dial that back, darling. 3 times your normal sensitivity should be a bit more reasonable. You won't remember this compulsion either. Leaning back, I watched as she finally managed to fully calm down, staring up at me with more fear than I'd seen of her yet. Smiling pleasantly, I brought up a finger before her eyes before slowly bringing it down to touch her. I raised an eyebrow as she flashed off of the bed before I could touch her, slamming into the far wall to avoid me. I made no move towards her, and a moment later she fled the room despite her current state of undress, leaving the mansion I'd brought her into and attempting to flee into the woods. Attempting was a good word for it, for as soon as she got outside of 100 feet of me she screamed in imagined pain, falling to her knees before fleeing for the shade of the nearest tree. Unfortunately for her, this took her further away from me. Eventually she managed to flash back into range, returning to the mansion as I walked down the stairs to greet her in the foyer. She was panting heavily, her body completely fine, but I knew she had felt as if she was burning up and that sensation still lingered. With my pleasant smile still on my face, I crooked a finger at her, beckoning for her to come to me. She was clearly reluctant, but she came to me anyways, understanding the carrot-and-stick approach I was taking to this easily enough. As she got within reach of me, I pulled her into a hug and she melted into my embrace with a mixture of a relieved sigh and a light moan. I pet her hair casually as contact with my body seemed like a balm to her still burning skin. She found her voice as she couldn't stop herself from nuzzling my neck. You feel so good. I chuckle at that before gripping her hair firmly and pulling her head back to look in her eyes. Yes, but not unbearably anymore, correct? I don't want to break you too early after all. Her response is to look up at me shyly, batting her eyelashes. No, master. It feels just right. I can't help the snort that escapes me at that, grabbing her by the chin and looking into her eyes. Tell me what's really going through your pretty little head right now. She immediately answered truthfully, her eyes widened in suppressed horror as she did so involuntarily. I am afraid of death and even more afraid of centuries of endless torture. I am happy to act as your willing sex slave until I can find a way to undo whatever spell you've binded me with and manage to escape you. I grin at her words and formulate a reply, speaking slowly as I keep her eyes locked with mine. For the next 100 years you will not be allowed to even try to seek a way to untie yourself from me. After that time has passed, you may begin to try. Now, how do you feel? She looks at me in horror even as she once again replies truthfully, breathing out a single word, helpless. I grin and respond with one word as well, my voice a purr as I look down at my new toy. Good. 1914 to 1919 AD. New Orleans. Ravia stood aside as she watched Cole plot behind Klaus' back, just as her master said would happen. She watched as Cole failed and was once more daggered, once more just as her master had said. There was plenty she could have done, but nothing she would do, not when this was how her master said things needed to go. A few short years later she watched as Rebecca and Marcel reconciled and rebuilt their hidden relationship. Things were finally coming to a head as her master had said, and Ravia watched from the shadows as Rebecca and Marcel plotted with one another to summon Michael with the help of a red-haired witch. She watched as only a short time later Niklaus admitted that he knew Marcel and Rebecca were going behind his back, and then proceeded to legitimize their relationship. She watched as Rebecca tried to undo the spell, only to find out it couldn't be undone. She watched Rebecca kill off the red-haired witch to keep it a secret, and she still did nothing. When Michael finally arrived and burnt the city to the ground in pursuit of his children, Ravia was hidden away until the end of it, waiting for Klaus, Elijah and Rebecca to run and then for Michael to follow before going to Marcel. He regarded her with suspicion when she approached, eyes narrowed as he accused her. "Where were you tonight? I thought you were oath-bound to serve the originals to help them?" Ravia just smiled and shook her head. "I am oath-bound only to my master Marcel Gerard. He sees in you the makings of a king. If you would have me, I would help you rebuild this city, take control and rule it." Marcel scoffed at that, frowning severely. "And I suppose all that's asked of me is loyalty to your master then? Am I to swear my fealty to him in exchange for his help so that he can rule New Orleans from afar?" Once again Ravia just shakes her head, smile still in place. "My master asks nothing in exchange for his help. One day he will rule this entire world, but he wants allies and friends who are capable of ruling alongside him, not stooges. He has no need of your fealty and obedience when he already has his disciples. He wants your independence and creativity to blossom and thrive out from under Lord Klaus' thumb. He wants to see what you can turn New Orleans into with his support." Marcel still seems wary, but eventually he nods. "Fine. Where do we start?" Ravia's smile widening exponentially, she told him. Unfortunately for Ravia, her master was not as omnipotent as he might pretend to be. Earlier in the night, a conversation had taken place between Niklaus and Michael that had been changed by virtue of Vala's meeting with Klaus in the 16th century. XX scene breaks X. 1919 AD. New Orleans Opera House. Klaus felt his presence before he felt the white oak stake against his back, but by that time there was no fleeing as Michael settled into the chair behind him. He was forced to sit there and listen to Michael belittle him and threaten him for several minutes. When he finally had a chance to talk, he fired back, claiming that he no longer feared death given all he'd achieved in New Orleans. There was nothing but rage and anger coursing through Klaus' veins as Michael spoke of destroying every last person who remembered his name, of tearing down everything he built. So he told Michael exactly how he'd been fooled for so long. "You may kill me here, Michael, you may destroy everything I've built, but no matter what, Vali will remain afterwards." Michael actually sounded confused as he responded to that. "Is that supposed to mean something to me, boy? You were always the one I wanted dead. The others, including Vali, are my true children after all." Klaus let out a barking laugh at that, shaking his head in mirth. "Even after 900 years you still don't know? Vali has had you fooled all this time." Michael sneered and pushed the white oak stake's tip a bit harder against Klaus' back. "Speak less in riddles, or I will grow tired of this charade and end you earlier than intended." Klaus just smiled as he spoke the truth that would hopefully hurt Michael more than anything else. "Vali is my blood brother, Esther's second indiscretion against you. She betrayed you twice, Michael, and Vali has managed to keep you focused on me for all this time. Imagine what he's managed to build without you nipping at his heels. I am entirely content even if you kill me here and now, knowing that he has bested you at every turn." Michael is completely silent, but Klaus knows that he can hear the truth in the words. Klaus has not told a single lie after all. Michael's shock is so profound that his banter is dead even when the curtain opens to reveal what he's wrought and the audience begins to clap and laugh. Klaus uses Michael's distraction to get down to the stage and attempt to save Marcel, only for Michael to regain his senses and stop him. Rebecca intervenes, Klaus fights back, and at the end of it all Elijah shows up and they all escape together. As they abandon the burning city, Klaus can't help but look back at all the work lost. He considers the fact that Mikael now knows about Vali, and then considers whether he should try to get word to his blood brother about the matter. As he looks at the burning city and realizes that Marcel is probably dead, he clenches his jaw. 900 years of running and hiding. Vali had spoken of finding a way to kill Mikael, and Klaus was happy to let him try. But after everything he'd lost, he had no desire to lend a hand to his wayward brother. XX scene breaks X. This is how it feels to be Mikael, the one they call the Destroyer, the vampire who hunts vampires right now. For the first time since your wife's death, you feel actual physical pain in your heart. You don't want to believe the abomination's words, but you know in your heart that they are true. You are furious. You've certainly been angry for a long time, using that anger to hunt your wayward children. But now you find that the one child you didn't think you had to hunt has used you for centuries. The betrayal is all the more poignant now that you recognize his actions for what they are. He took you like a weapon, like an arrow or a bullet, and launched you at his own siblings before turning and walking away. You are beyond furious by now, to a point of startling calm as you go over every interaction you ever had with the child. Slowly you begin to realize just how much he must have known from far too young an age. You were used to build up a son who was not your own, teach him and nurture him, make him strong. He played you beautifully even as you strived not to show him an ounce of weakness, of affection. But now, when such lies have been revealed, now is the time to be brutally honest with oneself. And if you are being honest, you must admit that out of all your children, Vali had earned his place as your favorite. From a young age he treated Esther's lessons, her attention, her love like something to be exasperated with. He'd cozied up to you, gained your attention, and then attacked every task you gave him with a single-minded ferocity that reminded you of yourself. Vali had been everything you could have wanted in a son. You're going to have to kill him for that. 1925 AD Venezuela. When Mikael began actively hunting for me, he found it slightly easier to track me down than it had been to find his other children over the last several centuries. At the same time, I almost immediately found out about his movements after he murdered one of my disciples in Mexico. Deciding to meet with him in Venezuela, I brought Katerina along, prepared for his arrival, and spread word of where I could be found. We came face to face on the lawn outside a large compound I'd had built nearly a century ago to house the disciple I had running this part of my territory. Katerina stood at my side as Mikael approached at human speed and came to a stop a few dozen feet away. I smiled good-naturedly and spread my arms wide in a welcoming gesture despite having a good idea of why Mikael was here. Father. I'm rather cross with you. You killed one of my children. If you wanted to speak with me, you could have simply asked for an audience. He sneered at that and pointedly withdrew the white oak stake from his jacket. Part of me was surprised and part of me wasn't. Either he didn't know it could only be used once, or he was actively making the choice to kill me instead of Niklaus. I have no desire to speak with you, boy. I am here to end you and this farce of an empire you've built. I raise an eyebrow at that. Really now? I suppose Klaus must have told you. I'll admit, Father, I'm a bit surprised. Even knowing the truth, I'd expect you to want to kill Klaus over me, given what he did to our mother. Your wife. His eyes narrow at my blatant attempt at manipulation and he shakes his head. Niklaus will get what he deserves. He has fled from me for 9 centuries, but he will not always be able to escape my grasp. You, on the other hand, have been brazen in your use of me as a weapon. Do not deny that you sent me after your own siblings so long ago, told me that I must kill your brother before you would rejoin your family. You played me quite well, boy, but now I know the truth, and I will destroy everything you have made for the way you manipulated me. I chuckle and sigh, as you wish, Father. A twitch of my finger and my children are on either side of him, tossing enchanted chains like lassos around his arms and neck, pulling sharply and immobilizing him in an instant. He snarls in anger but manages to keep a hold of the white oak stake even as he struggles against the strength of the 20 vampires, each of which had 8 centuries of age. It's a testament to his strength that he doesn't drop his only weapon against me. I smiled as I slowly stepped forward, Katerina staying behind. These are my children, Father. The comrades of the one you murdered in Mexico. From behind Mikael come 3 young women, their arms up and pointing at Mikael's head as they chanted. He screamed in pain and finally dropped the stake in his grasp, allowing me to easily catch it and press the tip firmly against his chest. And these are the witches allied with me. I wish that I could have shown you my werewolves, shown you just how many of the race that spawned Niklaus and I still live, but it's better that there be as few witnesses as possible to this. I smile as I slowly push the stake into Michael's chest, causing him to roar in pain. I stop just shy of impaling his heart and lean in to speak so quietly that only he, Katerina, and my disciples will hear it. I want you to know that I would have been content to spend the rest of my life calling you father. You were there for me when my blood father cowered behind his indiscretion with my mother. You raised me as your own, and you taught me the most important lesson of all. Strength and power are all that matter in the end. You taught me how to be strong. So for that, Michael, I will always be grateful. He stared at me with nothing but hate, and I plunged the stake into his heart without another word, releasing him as he burnt to ash, the chains holding him going lax as his body fell apart within them. The white oak stake burned as well, and I just smiled as Katerina approached cautiously. She stayed silent, but I knew her too well by this point, and eventually I sighed. You may ask Katerina. With a slow gulp, she spoke what was on her mind. That was what Klaus ran from for 900 years. The one thing he feared. I continued to look at the burning body of my father for a long moment before nodding. Indeed, Michael, our overbearing father and his weapon, the last piece of a tree that could have killed us. Eventually she spoke again, and I smiled at the reverent tone in her voice. Master, you are much more terrifying than your brother. I laughed at that, even as the three witches who'd come to help finish this approached. Their leader stepped forward with her head held high, and I smiled at the show of pride and strength they were trying to present. The destroyer is dead and his weapon is gone with him. We are owed. I grin and nod. Of course, my dears. If you provide my disciples with a list of the subjects you wish to research, they will have the appropriate grimoires copied from my collection and brought to you to study. The jaw of the lead witch clenches at that. We will not see the library itself? I smile and shake my head. Not unless you plan to leave your people behind forever. The archivists in my library choose that path for life in pursuit of knowledge, knowing that they will never leave the temple where it's located. The spells that my allied witches have added to the location over the centuries make sure of that. The lead witch nods and seems to accept that, but one of the other two steps forward. She's a bit younger, but she has this determined look in her eyes that I can appreciate. I have no family left to leave behind. I am willing to become one of these archivists you speak of. I raise an eyebrow and nod. I do not want you to go into this under false pretenses. You will be required to open your mind to several of my disciples so that they can make sure your intentions are honest. Are you prepared to do this, to reveal any secrets you may have for the chance at knowledge? When she nodded again, I smiled. Wonderful. Once again, I thank the three of you for your assistance. You and your descendants have me forever in your debt. Looking to the two who would be returning to the witches, I spoke a bit more gravely. That said, nobody can know what has happened here today. If you speak of this and word of Michael's demise spreads, I will know, because my children and Katerina here literally cannot betray me. I hope you understand that my displeasure at such a thing happening would be legendary. I look them each in the eye as I finish with this. I am the greatest ally you have in the pursuit of magic and knowledge. Please do not make me your enemy. I receive a nod from both in response, and I smile, considering the matter closed. I turn back to the compound and leave the witches to my disciples, as well as the ashes left over from Michael's death. Katerina follows closely behind me, her mood quite clear when we finally find privacy, and she immediately strips her clothing off before attempting to jump me. I laugh as she pins me to the bed, before I flip us both over so that she's under me, one hand moving between her thighs to feel how wet her slit is, while the other holds her in place by her throat. She moans at my touch, panting and mewling at me like a kitten in heat, her desire obvious. I pull my hand away after a moment, and she whines in displeasure, only to be silenced when I place the fingers now wet with her juices to her lips, causing her to eagerly suckle them clean. I press her back against the bed and lock eyes with her, initiating compulsion. Katerina, you will forget that I can compel you to tell the truth, and you will forget that I am compelling you right now. I waited for the compulsion to take hold and her eyes to clear before smiling and tracing a finger around one of her nipples. Katerina, you have been with me now for a little over 60 years. I control every aspect of your existence, so tell me what you think of me. Be honest now. She looks at me with as seductive a face she can manage while being pleasured by my very touch. Master, you are my reason for existing. I love you and everything you are. You are strong and powerful, and I cannot imagine a world where I do not remain by your side for all time. I am yours to do with as you please. I cannot even reach climax without your touch any longer. You've taken me over completely. I chuckle softly at her honeyed words before once more compelling her. Now then, darling, tell me the truth of what you think of me. Her eyes cloud over in horror as she's forced to tell me the truth. I both hate you and love you. I do not want you dead, but I don't know if that's because you've compelled me or because of my feelings for you. If I had the chance, I would escape you, but I would miss your touch dearly. I truly cannot reach climax without you anymore, and this scares me more than anything. You are breaking me and rebuilding me as you said you would, and every year that passes more and more of me accepts it. I fear for my sanity that my very identity will be overwritten by what you want me to become. I smile and nod, prompting her to ask the question on her mind even as she shuddered in pleasure under my continued caresses. Why do you do that to me? Allow me to believe that I can lie to you and then drag the truth out of me right after. I grin at that even as I slide a finger up and down her exposed center, running it over her wet slit in a way that just made her grow more and more aroused. You can learn a lot about someone from their lying, Katerina. What they are willing to lie about, how they lie, all of these are facets of a person's being. You willingly sacrifice your body to me in an effort to keep your soul intact. Unfortunately, it is not working very well for you, as your mind is slowly eroding before me as well. I grin as I look as she arches her back at my touch and closes her eyes. For example, you want me to fuck you right now, don't you? She let out a combination of a growl and a hiss as she answered with a heated, yes, without an ounce of compulsion from me. I just chuckled and flipped her over onto her front. She buried her face in the pillows and lifted her ass into the air like a bitch in heat, her desire incredibly clear. I obliged her a moment later, sliding my hard cock into her tight inviting passage after freeing it from the confines of my pants. Growling as I began to fuck her, I leaned over her and nibbled at her ear while whispering in her ear, "Did you get off on me killing my father? I had no idea you were such a slut, darling." All I got in response were moans of pleasure as my length slid along her insides and caused her to orgasm violently underneath me. But it didn't end there as I truly began to piston in and out of her inviting cunt, turning her moans into pleasured screams, as I fucked climax after climax from her, each one tearing a bit more of her resistance away like I'd been doing for every day of the last 60 years. Truthfully, as I reached under her to knead and maul her delicious tits, I had to admit that I was proud of Katerina. She truly did have a fire to her that still wasn't extinguished after 60 years of pure pleasure. Even after all this time, she was still waiting for a way out. Eventually, she was unconscious by sheer virtue of the pleasure overload I forced on her system, and I was lying next to her smiling, ghosting my fingers over her beautiful dark curls. Perhaps I'd play a bit of a game eventually and release her for a time. It would make it all the more entertaining when she fell back into my grasp. I wondered if I let her escape me, would I be the thing she most feared? Would it be me she ran from instead of Klaus? After all this time, she knew that all she had to fear of Klaus was physical torment. But as she'd told me under compulsion, I threatened her very sanity. Chuckling, I lay back and pulled my pet closer, letting her nuzzle into my neck as I wrapped an arm around her and fell asleep.